Buenos dias. I'd like to welcome you to this public meeting of the Financial Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico. As I'll say in a little bit more detail in just a minute, we will be streaming both in English and in Spanish. As you can tell, I'm a new person sitting in the chairman's seat, so I'd like to take just a brief moment to once again thank our prior chair, Jose Carrion, for his 4 years of chairmanship and the terrific job he did. Also for the 3 other board members who are no longer on the board, Carlos Garcia, Arthur Gonzalez, and Jose Gonzalez. Extraordinary service from each of them. I'd like to particularly recognize Judge Arthur Gonzalez, who's the one member who has been replaced since the last board meeting. His appointment terminated with the appointment by the president of Justin Peterson. And I would like to welcome Justin Peterson, our newest member to the board. As you can see, Justin is already well underway, fully engaged in the work of the board, and will be an excellent addition to the board. Hopefully, we'll have 7 board members soon. As you'll be able to see, if you didn't know already, we have 4 members at this point, and the full board is 7. Hopefully, the reappointments or appointments will be made soon. But in the meantime, as we've done from day one, the board will continue with the work that we've been doing without skipping a beat. One of my goals for however long I'm chair is to continue the board's commitment to transparency both for the government of Puerto Rico, so the people of Puerto Rico can see what's happening within the government, and for the board itself. And consistent with that, we're planning to have even more public board meetings than we've had in the past, so that the people of Puerto Rico can see as we make our decisions and get a sense of how we're looking at the issues and how the decisions are made. The objective, as it's been from the beginning, is to accomplish the goals of PROMESA and bring the board to an end so that the board can be dissolved. Our executive director, Natalie Juresco, will say a bit more about that in just a few minutes. I'd like to ask for everybody who is connected live to this video conference to cooperate on conducting a productive meeting, including keeping yourselves on mute except when you're talking. The fewer people whose mics are live, the easier it will be for everyone else to hear. So to get our meeting started, I'd like to conduct a roll call so we can determine which members are present and whether we have a quorum for the purposes of the meeting. So starting with Mr. Biggs, Andrew Biggs.
I'm present.
Ms. Matasantos?
Present.
Mr. Peterson?
Present.
And our ex officio member, who I neglected to recognize just a minute ago, so let me recognize him first, Omar Marrero, who is the head of FOMB, among other things, and is the governor's appointee to the board. We appreciate his service on the board as well. Mr. Marrero, are you here?
Yes, sir. I'm present. Thank you, Chairman. Good morning.
Thank you, Mr. Marrero. So we have a quorum for the meeting, and the meeting is therefore now called to order. The one other administrative thing I'd like to do is ask our general counsel, Mr. Jaime El Khoury, if he would be willing to serve as secretary for this meeting.
Yes, I will.
Thank you, Mr. El Khoury. Thanks to all of you in attendance at this public meeting, which, as I've already noted, is being held by video conference, and to those watching the live stream of the meeting on the board's website. The board's website is www.oversight.pr.gov, G-O-W. I'm pleased to say, as I noted earlier, that the audio of the meeting is being webcast both in English and with a simultaneous Spanish translation, and that it's also being translated in sign language as well. If you log into the English website, the audio will be in English. If you log in from the Spanish website, you'll hear the simultaneous translation in Spanish.
I'm on the meeting.
The Oversight Board will be handling the public's questions and comments through a form that's available on our website. So if you click the webcast page and you want to ask a question, fill the form, including your name and any questions or comments, and the board will answer them later during this public meeting. The public will have, from the time the meeting starts, so basically from now, up to 15 minutes prior to the public comments period to share questions or comments or anything you want to say on this forum. We'll answer as many of these questions as we have time for towards the end of the meeting. If we run out of time to answer them all, we'll answer them later and post them on the website. So you can be sure your questions will be answered, even if we're not able to answer them live right now. In addition to the folks on the board I've already recognized, I would like to recognize all of the other public officials and private sector representatives who will be joining us today, and they will be briefly introduced as they begin to speak. So we have a lengthy agenda for today. Let me very quickly go through the agenda items. We have 11 items on the list. Hopefully we can do this expeditiously, but it is a very full agenda. The first thing we'll do is we'll have approval of the minutes of the public meeting and executive sessions of the board. Second, we'll have administrative matters. Third, we'll have an update from the executive director. Fourth, we'll have a section 204B of PROMESA contract review policy update. Fifth, we'll have a section 104G FOMB internal contract approvals update. Sixth, we'll have a discussion of section 204B reapportionments and reprogrammings. Seventh, of section 207 municipal debt. Eighth, we'll have a discussion of Act 154. Ninth, we'll have a section 313 Commonwealth Plan of Adjustment modification discussion. 10th, we'll have a public comment period, and 11th will be other matters. And with all these section numbers that I've just mentioned, we will describe them more fully as each item on the agenda comes up. So we have 11 different items on our agenda. The first of those items is approval of the minutes, and in particular approving the minutes of the board's last public meeting held on August 4, 2020, and the minutes of the board's executive sessions held on the dates listed in Appendix A. The proposed minutes will be attached to the meeting and are attached to all board members' meeting materials. And so let me ask whether there are any questions about these minutes or records of executive sessions. Okay.
Hey, David. I have a question. It's not about the minutes themselves, but it's about voting thresholds for the minutes. I would normally abstain because I was not at the last meeting, but I want to make sure that that does not keep the motion from carrying if one motion is made. Jaime, can you help us walk through on this one?
Well, I think Mr. Peterson is in a somewhat similar position. I assume that they can vote, but let me ask our general counsel, Mr.
Well, can we abstain and have the motion still carry?
It would be, if we have 3 votes, it will carry. Abstentions don't count.
Okay, so you have to have a total of 3. Okay, got it. Thank you.
Any other questions on the minutes or the executive sessions? Will a board member move to approve the minutes?
Sure, this is Andrew Biggs. I move to approve the minutes of the board's public meeting is held on August 4th, 2020, and the meetings of the board's executive sessions held on the dates listed in Appendix A in the form presented to the meeting.
I'll second the motion.
Thank you, Ms. Matasantos. So we have a motion and a second. Can we have a voice vote first of those voting in favor? Yes.
Yes.
So I think we have at least 3 in favor. Any voting no? And any abstentions? Okay. All of the members having voted in favor of the motion, the minutes are approved. Second issue we have is just general administrative matters. Would somebody be willing to make this motion?
Sure. I'd like to make the following motion. The board confirms and approves the unanimous written consents adopted by the board since the adjournment of the board's last public meeting, which are listed in Appendix B here too.
Do we have a second for that?
Sure, I'll second.
Thank you, Ms. Matasantos. So we have a motion and a second. Once again, let me ask for a voice vote. First, all in favor, say yes.
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 Any opposed? All the members having voted in favor of the motion, this motion is approved as well. So we have another motion. Will somebody or would somebody like to make the next motion?
I can do it again. Mr. Chair, I would like to make.
Tired of making motions. This is what happens when you have four people on a board.
I do this one at every meeting. Resolution between the adjournment of this meeting and the opening of the board's next public meeting, board may consider an executive session any and all matters that it is authorized to consider under PROMESA, including first, any certification determinations authorized per PROMESA, including certification determinations under Section 206 of PROMESA. Second, any submissions or authorizations authorized by PROMESA. And third, any filings authorized under Title III of PROMESA in each case that are set forth as part of the vote to convene such executive session. The board may also act by unanimous written consent between meetings in accordance with the bylaws, with such consent to include consent by electronic transmission.
Now, do we have a second to this motion?
I'll second.
Thank you, Ms. Matasantos. Can we have a voice vote? All in favor, please say yes.
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 Any opposed? All 4 members having voted in favor, this motion is approved as well. So we're making very good progress. We've gotten through the first 2 items on our agenda. The third item on our agenda is the update from the executive director. So I would like to recognize Executive Director Natalie Jaresko for her update.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Since our last public meeting on August 4th, the Oversight Board has experienced board member changes. We welcomed a new chairman, Mr. David Skeel, and a new board member, Mr. Justin Peterson. We are grateful for their service to this board towards fulfilling the goals of PROMESA. As the world experiences a global pandemic, Puerto Rico has not been spared, and the number of confirmed positive COVID-19 cases on the island is now over 33,000, and we have lost 800 lives to this terrible pandemic. As a result, Puerto Rico's economy has suffered significant losses, changing the reality of all Puerto Ricans. Nevertheless, the board has continued its work towards fiscal responsibility and removing structural barriers to economic development. I'd like to share a couple of highlights with you of the work done in the past 3 months. At the last public board meeting, Boston Consulting Group presented a report on pharma and manufacturing opportunities for Puerto Rico in light of the pandemic. And since then, we've held over 20 meetings with local stakeholders, with the governor, with the government of Puerto Rico, with the US House and Senate staff to share our findings, to inform of potential legislation that could be of benefit to the island. Second, the Oversight Board submitted recommendations to the government of Puerto Rico for legislative changes that would improve Puerto Rico's property tax system to become more fair and more efficient. The Oversight Board recommends broadening the tax base by removing or reducing exemptions and exonerations, measuring the tax base by the true market value of properties rather than on the last assessments of real estate values from 1957, and reducing the statutory tax rate. The Oversight Board has become aware, also since the previous board meeting, of at least $80 million in payments over the past 13 years that the Puerto Rico Department of Education made to employees who had resigned, retired, possibly were deceased, on vacation, or otherwise not working, because the Department of Education lacks an automated system that ensures only employees who are working get paid. And since then, we've been working with the government of Puerto Rico and the Department of Education to rectify the situation. We'll be talking a little bit more about next steps, resolving the situation later in this meeting. The Oversight Board has also welcomed the request for proposal by the Puerto Rico Fiscal Agency and Financial Advisory Authority, FOMB. Thank you, Mr. Marrero. In collaboration with the Oversight Board, it has been issued to expand broadband access for the people of Puerto Rico. And broadband is a crucial resource for Puerto Rico residents, for Puerto Rican businesses, for the Puerto Rican healthcare system, particularly now during COVID-19. Broadband provides benefits to communities by increasing business productivity, providing access to healthcare through telemedicine, and enhancing civic participation. Finally, I'll just say that the policy and research team at the Oversight Board has provided recommendations on how to best support small and medium-sized businesses during the pandemic, and it's developed a roadmap towards improving the civil service in Puerto Rico. I'm going to put up some slides. Even though the work of the Oversight Board is important for Puerto Rico's economic future, all of us can agree on one thing, and that is that we would like the Oversight Board to complete its work under PROMESA as soon as possible, such that fiscal controls, fiscal sustainability, most importantly, economic prosperity and growth can return to Puerto Rico, its residents and its businesses. PROMESA was intended to have a defined life, defined goals, and defined tools and authorities to achieve those objectives. And every action taken by the Oversight Board over the past 4 years has been dedicated specifically and only to completing this mission, as stated in the law, as soon as possible. I thought, given the importance of this discussion on the island recently by gubernatorial candidates in the upcoming elections, as well as off the island, I would take just a few minutes to walk through what that mandate is and under what conditions we can successfully, as soon as possible, complete the work of the Oversight Board in Puerto Rico. PROMESA is very specific in terms of how and when the Oversight Board can be terminated. PROMESA has 2 provisions that define when the Oversight Board can be terminated. And these provisions were incorporated into PROMESA to ensure that the board disappeared for good once Puerto Rico's financial outlook stabilized and better financial management processes had been put in place. Over the next few minutes, I would like to share insights on each of these provisions and the requirements the government would need to meet, the areas of fiscal governance that need to be improved for the Oversight Board to be able to go away. Please go to the next slide. The first requirement mandates Puerto Rico's government has adequate access to short-term and long-term credit markets at reasonable interest rates to meet the borrowing needs of the territorial government. The most important elements of this provision are, first, Puerto Rico has adequate access, and second, that it's achieved at reasonable interest rates. So it must be asked, and I get asked often, what is required for the government to achieve adequate access to credit markets and reasonable interest rates? There are 2 essential components at a bare minimum to regaining credit market access at reasonable rates. First, to achieve that, first and foremost, the government must have exchanged its defaulted debt for new debt. In other words, we need to bring the bankruptcy of the government to a close. I do not believe that Puerto Rico has to actually borrow again, to prove that it has regained market access in order to meet this requirement. However, symbolic of future market access would be if those newly issued bonds trade well in the municipal bond market, and interest in the new debt, buyers of the new debt are traditional institutional municipal bond buyers. Through the COFINA restructuring, as an example, Puerto Rico has started to show that this is possible. And now the government must achieve the same result for the remaining debt that must be restructured in a manner that's sustainable for the island's economy. We'll discuss this further later today, but key to sustainability of any debt restructuring is the growth of the Puerto Rican economy. And as we've stressed for the past 4 years, returning to economic growth requires the structural reforms in electricity, in human capital and welfare, in the ease of doing business, in the investment in infrastructure that can enable Puerto Rico to be a competitive economy, attract investment, the creation of new jobs, and ultimately provide a better life for the residents of this island. The second part of this has to do with timely financial reporting. This includes in particular the publication of past due audited financial statements and the reasonable expectation that future audited financial statements will be issued on a timely basis. The Oversight Board has continuously pressed the government to finalize and publish its past due audited financial statements, including spending, as you all know, quite a bit of time at 2 recent public board meetings on the topic and providing increased funding for increased required personnel at Hacienda. If you go to the next page, we can discuss where we are, the progress we've achieved so far, or the government's achieved so far on achieving these components within that first requirement. This page lays out some of the critical steps the government needs to take to achieve that timely financial reporting and the current status of each of the steps. These steps include many things that we've discussed previously in our public hearings, in our meetings with the government, such as providing a detailed timeline and implementation plan, positioning Hacienda to successfully oversee that publication of CAFRs, and signing a multi-year audit contract. Perhaps most importantly, the government has to transition to implementing monthly closing procedures and bank reconciliations over its books and implement strict monitoring over the process with consequences for any agency that falls behind, causing the CAFRs to fall behind. Without implementing these changes, the CAFR issuance will continue to be delayed and unpredictable. As shown, the government is behind on many of these requirements, but with renewed political will and leadership, the Oversight Board is convinced that these objectives can be reached, the CAFRs can be issued within the next 2 years, and a system can be put in place that assures continued timely issuance as expected by the credit markets. Let's go to the next slide. The second requirement in Promesa has 2 parts. If you go to the next slide, what you'll see are the key elements of that. Collectively, this requirement can be viewed as developing and implementing a budget in accordance with modified accrual accounting standards for 4 consecutive years. Please go to the next slide. Before Promesa, Puerto Rico had a history of overstating revenues and understating or misstating or not stating at all some of its expenditures in a given year. And this lack of budgetary control enabled budgets which appeared to be balanced when adopted to be consistent with Puerto Rico's constitutional requirements, while in fact they resulted in deficits, unchecked spending, and the situation that we find ourselves in today. By transitioning to modified accrual accounting budgeting, that standard required under the law, the books and records will present a more realistic picture of spending and to help Puerto Rico to rebuild lost confidence in its financial picture. On this page, you see some of the differences between the current methodology and an accrual-based methodology. Key amongst these is the more conservative, accurate timing around the recognition of costs. Adoption of this modified accrual for budgets would eliminate many one-time adjustments and lead to genuinely balanced budgets. It has been done before, and it can be done here. While the transition to modified accrual was not the only element that led to New York's financial recovery in the 70s, it did help to impose stricter budgetary discipline on the city. Go to the next slide. As I mentioned before, we need to develop these budgets under the new standard so the board can be dissolved. Next sentence. Next. On this slide, these are some of the key principles, and I won't go through each and every one of them, that would need to be met in order to meet the requirement. Some combination of these, some progress in these are necessary to achieve the targets. Among these, formulation of an accrual-based budget, regular monitoring of revenues and expenses, and integration of the payroll systems, maintenance of an accounts payable ledger, registration of purchase orders, budgeting for all funds, not just the general fund. And if you see on the next slide, there are a number of specific things that have to happen under each category. For example, under accrual budgeting, the government would need to train employees in how to book these expenses across all 114 agencies and public corporations. It would have to be communicated and it has to be coordinated. These accruals need to be reconciled in our agency. Accounts payable has to be more automated, and there have to be clear procedures for the timing of the entrance of purchase order or other encumbrances during the course of the year. And as many special revenue funds as possible must be eliminated, so most funds flow through the general fund. Go ahead. The government also has to meet the second requirement around the budget implementation for the next 4 years. So successfully implementing, next slide, a balanced budget has 3 main components. First, there has to be proper accounting. That includes, as I've said earlier, monthly closings, bank reconciliations, proper recording of expenses on a timely basis, and measures to increase the efficiency of doing it. Second, there have to be proper systems, including the integrated financial systems, visibility into spending, real-time reporting, as accurate as is possible. And finally, there have to be proper controls in place, real-time spending controls, standardized procedures, among others. Go ahead. And to achieve all that, the government has to begin to connect its systems, something we just talked about, and we'll talk about again with regard to time and attendance and payroll. It has to be doing a considerable amount of new work. But again, there's nothing here that's not possible with strong financial management. Go ahead. All of this leads to a point that I'd like to convey. PROMESA requires the achievement of fiscal responsibility and access to capital markets, as well as provisions to improve Puerto Rico's fiscal governance, accountability, and internal controls. For the board to go away for good and never, not to come back, there are clearly defined parameters. And to date, it's been difficult to meet these parameters for a variety of reasons. One that I'd like to focus on is the lack of a strong, legislatively established, centralized office of the CFO. The financial management of 100 agencies and public corporations that make up the Commonwealth and are part of the Commonwealth CAFRs is distributed amongst dozens of organizations and managers without clarity of where the buck stops with regard to overall leadership and responsibility. It is absolutely true that our colleague, the executive director of AFAF, Omar Morado, is the CFO per executive order, but his authorities and the reach are limited, and the remainder of the government is not clearly and timely reporting to him on the breadth and the scope of issues that need to be resolved per my earlier discussion to achieve that fiscal sustainability, that accountability and balance, so that the government can have returned access to credit markets at reasonable rates. So we have consistently required and requested in the fiscal plans that legislation establishing the Office of the CFO should centralize all financial management functions, improve fiscal governance and forecasting, increase transparency, increase accountability, heighten internal controls, and improve stakeholder confidence in Puerto Rico's financial management. The objectives are clear: the elimination of budget deficits, cash shortages through proactive financial planning, strict management controls, sound budgeting, accurate revenue forecasts, authorized spending, and transparent financial reporting. All personnel with fiscal and financial responsibilities in agencies should be monitored by the OCFO, and the OCFO should also set all human resource and procurement policies for all departments of government. The entity I'm describing is very different than the coordinating CFO function that exists today, and it should be written into law with all the powers and authorities required to be an effective steward of Puerto Rico's finances. In fact, the CFO should have the ability to remove any fiscal officer in any executive branch agency for violations of or non-compliance with the law, including failure to provide timely and accurate fiscal and financial information, which is the singular thing that is affecting the CAFR issuance. The 4 main functions of this office that this office should oversee: fiscal policy and financial budgets. Second, accounting and audit policy. Third, treasury, tax and collections. Fourth, IT, HR, procurement and capital assets. In conclusion, we all need to keep our eye on the ball on the ultimate goals. What needs to be achieved to achieve the termination and enable the termination of the Oversight Board? We need to exit bankruptcy in a sustainable fashion and provide the market with assurances regarding timely issuance of future audits. And we need to have developed 4 years of budgets on a modified accrual accounting basis and implemented 4 years of balanced budgets. How best can we progress on these critical issues? What type of leadership is needed to accomplish these specific tasks? How can we assure that the authority and mandate of the Office of the CFO enables Puerto Rico's fiscal success, such that the issues that brought PROMESA to Puerto Rico are issues of the past, and deficit budgets, overborrowing, lack of consistent accounting are not controlled by La Junta as they are today, but instead by the government of Puerto Rico going forward? I think the single most conclusive answer is for the financial management and accountability to be a key objective of the government of Puerto Rico going forward, and that we pursue these goals with rigor and urgency. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Jaresko. Moving on to the next item on the agenda, we'll hear from Benjamin Rosa, Contract Review Director, regarding an update on the contract review policy. Welcome, Mr. Rosa.
Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry, Mr. Peterson.
Yeah, I had a few questions of the executive director.
Absolutely. So I should have asked for that before we moved on. Go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you. First of all, I want to say it's great to be here. Thank you for your kind remarks in your opening. And Mr. Chairman, I applaud your stated commitment to transparency in your recent comments in the press on ending the bankruptcy. That's something I'm really interested in, and I was really pleased to see it. And Natalie, I had a few questions on your presentation. I was also really pleased to hear you lay out the parameters on which we could end bankruptcy and get rid of the board, which is something that I'm really interested in. I don't believe that the people of Puerto Rico should be ruled in perpetuity by this oversight board. I believe they should be able to self-govern. And question I have for you, Natalie, and I invite anybody else on the board to weigh in with their thoughts, is whether or not we believe in the macroeconomic growth picture, whether or not we believe that capital and investment from investors are part of that picture, and whether or not we believe that when the Commonwealth creditors are dealt with and we have a plan of adjustment with them, we'll have capital and investment, and it will spur growth. I want to know if we're all working from the same baseline assumption with regard to that. That's my first question.
Absolutely. Capital investment is definitely part of the picture. In fact, I believe that getting through bankruptcy is one element of spurring that growth, but the second are the structural reforms to make Puerto Rico competitive again, transforming the electricity system. Without more reliable, cheaper electricity, I don't think you can spur the growth and the return of capital. The labor system, the ease of doing business, which includes the permitting, just the set of structural reforms are all aimed at doing exactly what you just said, which is spurring capital and investment back to the island.
I agree. The structural reforms are totally necessary. On the energy side, I completely agree with that. I applaud the board for the work it's done with the Luma deal. I think that's a great example of the kind of deals we need to be doing. So great point. My next question, do you believe that there is a structural reform threshold that is necessary in order to do a deal with the Commonwealth bondholders? It just seems to me, and this is my first board meeting, so I'm learning a lot, and I appreciate all of you for that. It just seems to me as an outsider watching that structural reforms have often been used as a reason for why we can't make progress, when in fact we had a deal in February of this year. And so I'd love to hear you comment with specificity on what kind of structural reforms you think have to happen before we can do a deal, which by your own admission, and I think all of us would agree, would help us grow the pie instead of just continuing to fight over the size of the pie.
Thank you. I don't believe there's any particular level that is required, but at each level that occurs, it produces growth, which produces revenues for the government. So the question is how much can happen to produce maximize the amount of growth, to maximize the amount of revenues that are then available for the debt restructuring. We have agreed on a series, and I'll call this the bare minimum of structural reforms. That level of structural reforms is what is in the fiscal plan each year, is what enabled that February plan of adjustment And it's what enables the proposals that you're going to hear later today. If those structural reforms were removed from the fiscal plan, then the projections on revenue would go down tremendously. So if you remove them entirely, then there are no funds to pay, not just debt, but there are no funds to pay for essential services, in the sense that those structural reforms are producing a substantial part of the growth in the revenues that is in the fiscal plan. The challenge that we've had is that even with all of those structural reforms, you still continue to see deficits past 2031 because they're not sufficient. There needs to be done, even more needs to be done. But rather than debate what more needs to be done, we have focused on those 5 areas that I mentioned. And the government has been in agreement on those 5 areas. And so we look for progress, we work together to make progress. Progress is uneven, sometimes delayed for good reason, like hurricanes and earthquakes. But I think that the structural reforms have not changed in the last couple of years, since we had a debate on one, which the legislature and government were unable to adopt. And that was removed because they clearly said they would not do it. All the others remain and have remained from the beginning. The challenge has been that they haven't been implemented, so you're not seeing the growth. And so it keeps getting pushed out, but they're all in the fiscal plan.
Understood. And I appreciate that. I'm glad to hear you state the need for us to define essential services too, so we don't have a moving target. I have one more.
I didn't actually say that we need to assign, we don't need to, and from my perspective,
I think we do.
We are required to make sure we fund them, and we are funding them.
Okay, I think we do. I have one more question. I don't want to bog the meeting down. Do we have our advisors on the phone? I'd like to ask one of them a question.
Yes, we do.
Martin, are you on the phone? Martin Beanstalk, are you on the phone?
Yes, I am. I'm sorry, I was having a problem unmuting myself. I'm on the phone.
So just going back to the first point I raised on how do we end bankruptcy? How do we get rid of the board? How do we let the people of Puerto Rico rule themselves, which I think is the way we ought to be approaching this. Do you think, as it relates to our ongoing discussions, I know we had this deal in February with the PSA group. Do you think that the gap between we and the creditors is bridgeable, that we can get to a deal? I'd like your opinion, stated for the record.
Yes. Well, okay. I'll give you my opinion, which in turn is based on discussions with our financial advisors. But yes, I think the gap between the creditors who we had a deal with originally is bridgeable. There are other creditor groups where the gap may not be bridgeable, but the gap with that major group is, I believe, is bridgeable.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, and I yield my the floor here. Thank you for letting me ask a few questions, Mr. Chairman.
Does anybody else want to comment or question? Ms. Jaresko, did you want to add anything, or does anybody else before we move on? I'll just say, well, we will be talking about these issues in more detail as we go through. This is hugely important. I completely agree with Mr. Peterson that it's time for Puerto Rico to get out of Title III. The question is, what can Puerto Rico afford? And that's what we've been wrestling with. That's what we'll be wrestling with a bit more later today. So why don't we turn to the next issue, which is the contract review policy update. And Mr. Rosa, if you're there, I'd like
yes.
to welcome. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Chairman Skill. The Contract Review Office at the Oversight Board operates under Section 204B of PROMESA. Currently, the office receives around 100 contracts per year for evaluation and determination of approval or rejection, averaging 1 contract per day received in the office. Our current contract review policy, enacted in 2017 and amended in 2018, needs to be updated to account for the increasing number of contracts received, the complexity of the contracts reviewed, and to establish firm timeliness so that the government provides the required documentation in a timely manner and that the Oversight Board is able to timely respond to the contracting agencies after its review. In our first slide, under Section 204B, as mentioned, of PROMESA, requires prior FOMB approval of certain contracts to assure that they promote market competition and are not inconsistent with the approved fiscal plan. The policy also underlines the sense of Congress, as provided in Section 204B3, that any policy under Section 204B2 should be designed to make the government contracting process more effective and to increase the public's faith in this process. While the law allows for the Oversight Board to exercise approval over any contract entered into by the Puerto Rico government, the board has elected to review prior to execution only contracts or series of related contracts, inclusive of amendments, modifications, or extensions with an aggregate expected value of $10 million or more. In the case of the University of Puerto Rico, the threshold is $2 million or more. On our next slide, conducting the review within the 7 business days review period is extremely challenging, given the number of contracts received, their complexity, and the in-depth analysis contemplated by PROMESA. In addition, the lack of uniformity of government contract submissions, along with incomplete submissions of required documentations for appropriate review, that creates a need for a more robust policy. Finally, there is a need to further define and refine what it means for the Oversight Board to conduct the evaluation of market competition and transparency elements required by PROMESA. I'll now walk you through the proposed changes of this policy. The changes are grouped into 3 main categories, which are scope, timelines, and certifications. Under scope, the following modifications are proposed. For the avoidance of doubt, purchase orders are expressly included in the policy. Specifically, the intention is to clarify that purchase orders are considered contracts under Puerto Rico law, and this policy, as they represent a substantial spend in government procurement and were not being submitted previously to the Oversight Board for review and approval before execution. Incorporate clear parameters for market competition evaluation to ensure that all procurements promote a robust and competitive process. Also, adding a differentiation in review period depending on contract type. Currently, all contracts are subject to the same review timelines, no matter the scope and complexity of the contract. The recommendation is to designate contracts related to infrastructure, construction and repair, public healthcare, and public-private partnerships as exceptional and not subject to the standard review period. Under timelines, we are proposing the following modifications. The proposed timeline is moving from 7 business day contract review to a maximum of 12 business days. Currently, agencies are not required to submit documentation within a specific time period. The proposed policy is to provide complete documentation 15 business days prior to the execution of new contracts and 30 calendar days prior to the execution of recurring amendments. Next slide. Under certifications, we are requesting approval for the following recommendations. Currently, we don't have a budget certification requirement. This modification contemplates requesting an updated fund availability certification for all accounts to be used for payments under the proposed contracts. Certifications must take into account all encumbrances as of the date of the document submission. The contractor's certification will now require the Chief Executive Officer to identify all subcontractors and the amount of the proposed contract payable to each, and a disclosure of any third-party interests under penalty of perjury. Any false statements, misrepresentations, or omissions will result in the nullification of the contract. Back to you, Mr. Chair. You're mute.
Thank you. I always say my most impressive things on mute. Are there questions for Mr. Rosa about the contract policy or about changes to the contract policy, either from one of the four of us or Mr. Marrero?
What's driving the number of cases, contracts that are coming forward?
Could you repeat the question, please? I'm sorry.
Sorry, what's driving the increases in the number of contracts that are moving forward for review?
Should I, you want me to?
Yeah, Jaime.
Yeah, I think we're seeing pretty much a stable number at this point, Anna. It's about the average is about 100 per year. We've been doing this, as you know, since post Hurricane Maria in 2017. Obviously, as the policy becomes more, as different agencies become more aware of the policy, no fault of their own. It's just the policy gets to be known more and more. They get submitted to us. So it's a combination of, one, the average is pretty stable, but we see that more and more agencies have become aware of the policy, are complying with it. So that's pretty much what's driving it.
I'll add that the complexity of some of them have changed simply because the government has come through P3 processes that were begun earlier, and we're getting to the end of processes that have been ongoing. For example, the Luma contract for more than 1 year. And so the P3s are kind of, they've been coming and now they're coming in larger number because the government's been successful in moving those plans forward.
Got it. So it's more of an anticipated increase and then a greater complexity for the ones that you are receiving.
Yes, we're not asking to see any more, and we're not changing the thresholds in any way.
I have several questions. Omar Marrero for the record. Even though obviously we all agree with transparency and accountability, something that I myself have implemented the different government posts that I have served, it seems that we are increasing the red tape here. Not only I'm seeing that some scope is being expanded, but and I totally understand that 7 days is not sufficient time. We have received many letters, many requests for information from the oversight board personnel in the past, and I can understand first-handedly 7 days is really hard for requests and sometimes to do a full review of the contract, even though it had several review before it was submitted to you. My question is related to emergency. Federal programs that are entirely funded by federal funds. I mean, imagine that would be without the scope of this contract review policy, to the extent that Title II expressly says that the federal authorized program or federal programs are without or outside of the scope of the board.
So, Jaime?
Yeah, again, Omar, what we try to do is consistency with the fiscal plan. We understand that we cannot impede any program, any federal program. That is absolutely, you're totally, absolutely correct. But we do have to see, provide some kind of oversight in terms of the implementation of the contracts that are awarded for that purpose.
And also to the extent that state funds are required for cost
You
share,
got
I
it.
understand.
You got it.
Just to be clear, Omar, if the agreement is between the government and the federal government, we never have asked for that. It's about the expenditure of funds by the government, not the agreement with the federal government.
Two more questions. I see, as to the subcontractor, I understand the concern. We have seen it many, many times. However, I think that we are going beyond what Puerto Rico law requires. And also, we are adding some duplication of requirement. For example, as to the nullification, we all know that any false statement, misrepresentation, or omission in the contract, it will invalid and nullify the contract. It seems, and again, I totally understand, but I just want to leave it for the record that the Puerto Rico legal framework already take care of that and provides for that. And obviously, contractors have to submit a certification that they have not convicted, they have not been found guilty of any dishonesty or public crime. So in that respect, it seems to me that, again, even though I'm totally committed to transparency and accountability, I just want to make sure that, again, it does not create additional bureaucracy or red tape, or more importantly, that in the end, just once again, we are concentrating in other matters instead of the big picture.
Yep. We are not, and there's no intention or desire to create bureaucracy. However, that statement being added to all contracts will serve as an important deterrent for those as they're signing. And so it has been a best practice in other states and other jurisdictions. We've also gotten quite a bit of kind of press from both citizens, residents, and other stakeholders. So I think that if you would just required it into every contract, it wouldn't be a lot of bureaucracy. It would just be a standard phrase in the contracts. And I think that the value that it serves of reminding everyone of exactly what you said, which is Puerto Rico law, will serve as a deterrent for misstatements.
Okay, I just wanted to leave it in the record that it is already required, but thank you. And next time, again, I will appreciate a lot if we could see the proposed amendment to the policy before, so we can look into it and understand it from operational perspective. But thank you.
Absolutely. Other questions from the board? Thank you again, Mr. Rosa. And now that we've come to the end of our questions, I'd like to ask whether one of the board members will make a motion to approve the updated contract review policy.
I move to update the contract review policy.
Thank you, Ms. Montesantos. Second?
I second.
Thank you, Mr. Biggs. We have a motion and a second. Let's have a voice vote. First of those in favor, then of those, or if any opposed. All in favor of these adjustments, please say yes.
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 Any opposed? The motion carries unanimously. So we can now move to our next agenda item, which is agenda item number 5, FOMB contract approval. It's an item about the approval of a contract provided professional services to the Oversight Board. Mr. Resco is going to describe and provide an overview of this request.
Thank you, Chairman Skill. Pursuant to the Oversight Board's internal contract approval policy, I request the board's consideration and approval regarding a contract to support the implementation of the Department of Education payroll and time and attendance integration. On September 30th, 2020, as I mentioned earlier, the Oversight Board publicly disclosed that for the past 13 years, the Department of Education has identified that it has been paying current and former employees for work not done. And based on the information provided, the incorrect payroll disbursements amounted to some $80 million. This practice resulted from a lack of policy and procedures governing time and attendance, as well as the lack of a direct link between time and attendance records and payroll. The government agreed to collaborate to put an end to this practice, starting at the Department of Education. And currently the Chronos system, which is the time and attendance system, is partially implemented at the Department of Education in the form of a time and attendance system. However, the system is not fully utilized or enforced, and it is not connected to payroll, such that payroll automatically takes into account absences, terminations, retirements, and other. Lack of urgent and immediate attention to this matter from the Department of Education and the government of Puerto Rico would allow a continued practice to set a precedence that's simply unacceptable, to not have clear policies, procedures, and practices around time and attendance. This issue has been raised since Hurricane Maria and the beginning of the required public time and attendance reporting that show again and again that the government does not yet have full knowledge, full control, or full accounting of time and attendance, and the relationship of time and attendance to payroll is practically non-existent. Not devoting attention to the Department of Education, which is the single largest employer in government with about 40% of total employees, would say that it's acceptable to pay employees who do not work or pay employees who have already left the system. And this would be at a time when employees have had to endure wage and benefit freezes since 2014 in order to restore balance in the budget. This is most unfair, in fact, to those who are working, who are indeed clocking their hours and teaching, in this case, the children of Puerto Rico. Why should someone who is not working receive the same payroll as the one who is? The systems to bring this to an end have existed inside the department for a decade. License fees have been paid, but the implementation has never been completed, and this must end. I urge your consideration to support the implementation of this department payroll and time and attendance integration, not solely for the focus and the purpose of correcting bad practices, but to focus on transparency and accountability and ensure these public dollars are appropriately utilized for the benefit of all Puerto Ricans. The vendor that I'm recommending today, MS Consulting, represented by Maritza Soto, would act as a project manager and an on-the-ground sponsor to ensure that the aggressive milestones we've put in place are met. The governor and the secretary had earlier promised full cooperation, and now we have established a schedule that exhibits the urgency with which everyone must act to bring these practices to an end. We expect the Department of Education to fully implement the policy and procedures throughout all schools and offices, enforcing it over all employees, including teachers, school personnel, central office employees, regional staff, and the full implementation of the time and attendance policy and integration to payroll should be in place by December 15th of this year, with paycheck adjustments to begin in January of 2021. To ensure that this important milestone is met, I want to set clear expectations that the project will not be easy. It will need the full and complete dedicated commitment from the Department of Education. The Department of Education must immediately identify a project lead and a working group to work full-time on these deadlines and put an end to the situation once and for all. The department must have a plan in place to dedicate the resources to this project now in full steam, unfortunately, notwithstanding COVID and the transition process that the government will be in post-elections to a new government, so that we can guarantee project completeness. And to manage this project, which includes technological solution implementations, communications with employees, training requirements, as well as overall project management, this consulting contract runs from November 1st through February 15th of 2021, with an investment capped at no more than $123,500. Is there another slide? This is the time frame that we are looking at for implementation and the outline of the work to be done in order to put this system in place. It is a very rapid timeline. It requires work in parallel along all those tracks with the support of the company that implemented Chronos, with the Department of Education, with the unions and employees and supervisors, as well as with Hacienda, which manages the payroll system room. So it is a yeoman's task, but it needs to be done, and we intend to get it done by the end of this year.
Thank you, Ms. Jaresko. Are there questions or comments from the board about this proposed consulting contract to deal with these problems at the Department of Education?
I think it's great, and thank you for the hard work on it, and also thank you to the Commonwealth for working with the board on this. More of this is a good thing.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Other comments or questions?
Mr. Chairman, I just want to say for the record that, again, as a good steward of public fund, we are totally against fraud, waste, and abuse. And obviously, this practice that has been in place for 13 years already, obviously does not serve the people of Puerto Rico, and even less the workers and the teachers and the students at the Department of Education. So as soon as we brought it up, so as soon as we discussed it with the executive director, we agreed to collaborate, and we're making sure, as well as the governor, we're making sure the Department of Education will be on top of this to make sure that doesn't happen again. And this practice not only is not repeated on the PRD, but also we make sure that does not happen at any other agency.
Thank you, Mr. Marrero. Any other comments or questions from the board? Can I have a motion to approve this contract to implement payroll and time and attendance connectivity at the Department of Education?
I move to approve.
Thank you. Do we have a second?
I second.
Thank you. Per usual, we'll have a vote to approve this contract for MS Consulting presented by Oversight Board's staff and attached to our materials as Exhibit 2. All those in favor, would you please say yes?
Yes.
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 Any opposed? The motion carries unanimously. Thank you, everyone. The next item on our agenda is Section 204C reapportionments. We'll be discussing reapportionments submitted by the government pursuant to Section 204 of PROMESA, and Janorli Maldonado, Fiscal Plan and Budget Director at the Oversight Board, will be presenting. So I'd like to welcome Ms. Maldonado. Hopefully you are on the line.
Thank you, Chairman Skeel. We now present for the Oversight Board's action a series of recommendations on reapportionment requests from the government of Puerto Rico, attached hereto as Exhibit 3.
For the sake of time, we won't be running through these individually. If the board members have any questions, we'd be happy to answer. Go to the next page.
Actually, it might be worth, just for the benefit of people who are watching, just briefly describing what a reapportionment is and what we'll be approving.
Certainly. Section 204 of PROMESA requires that any changes in the budget that was certified go through a reprogramming or reapportionment request process. The government, through OHEPET or the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, makes a request to move funds from one line to another, or to access funds that were not budgeted in the case of special revenue funds at some point. And we go through the process of ensuring that those funds are available, that they haven't been previously encumbered, that the movement of the funds is consistent with the fiscal plan, or in the case of special revenue fund, that the funds exist before they can be spent.
Thank you, Ms. Dresko. Anything more about the reapportionments? Any questions from the board? So this slide has all of the proposed responses to the reapportionments. Anything further? Then do we have a board member who will make a motion to approve these dispositions?
I move approval of the reapportionments.
Thank you. Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you. All board members in favor of approving these responses to reapportionment questions, please say yes.
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 Any opposed? The motion is approved unanimously. Thank you, Ms. Maldonado. Next item on our agenda, agenda item number 7, is municipal debt. And in particular, we'll be talking about a request for approval under Section 207 from the municipality of Carolina. And Herman Ojeda, Municipal Affairs and Legislative Review Director of the Oversight Board, will be presenting. Welcome, Mr. Ojeda, and hopefully you are on the line.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Chair. Thank you. At this point, I would like to present to the board loan transaction proposed by the municipality of Carolina. It's a transaction related to the construction of a municipal medical office building as well as a municipal parking lot. And the proposal entails the issuance or the entering into a new loan by the municipality of Carolina in the amount of $7,050,000. Next slide, please. The transaction we're presenting to you now, as you mentioned, falls under PROMESA Section 207, which basically provides that no territorial government or covered entity under PROMESA shall issue debt or guarantee, exchange, modify, or enter into similar transactions with respect to its debt without the prior approval of the Oversight Board. That's why we're discussing this here today. The proposed loan, the characteristics of this proposal are similar to the typical 207 transaction that we've seen in the last year and a couple of months. The significant difference here, as I mentioned, is the issuance of new debt. In prior instances, what we've seen is basically the refinancing of balloon payments that were expiring at the end of the period. Other characteristics such as interest rate, term loan, amortization period, and the important source of payment are all similar to prior transactions we have approved. Next slide, please. This is a more specific. The proposed transaction, as I mentioned, is the construction of a office building and a parking lot. The total cost of the project is $15.5 million. Other sources of funds include municipal general fund contribution of $4.4 million, as well as the reapportionment of prior loan surpluses, which were not utilized by the municipality. As of today, the transaction has been approved by both Banco Popular and AFAF. So approval by the Oversight Board today would be the final step on this transaction moving forward. Next page, please. Our analysis of the financial condition and documentation of the municipality of Carolina demonstrates the municipality's ability to afford this new $7 million loan. The repayment source for these loans is usually something called the special additional tax, which is part of the property tax collected by the municipalities. And this municipal debt is usually reserved 1 year in advance. So as of now, and based on projected forecast of special additional tax, or CAI as we call it in Spanish, by the municipality of Carolina, demonstrates the municipality's capacity to repay both existing debt and the new proposed $7 million loan. Next slide, please. And this is a more graphic representation of the municipality's CAI reserve, which, as can be seen, demonstrate a surplus which even goes up after FY23 as a result of the repayment of some existing debt. That's the increase in the light blue part of the bars. And again, the municipality's documentation demonstrates debt capacity over the projected 7-year period of the loan as well as existing debt. So, therefore, this loan is presented to the board members for your approval. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Ojeda. Any questions from board members about this proposed loan approval? I have one question, Mr. Ojeda. Could you say something about what we're doing when we decide whether to approve a loan? Are we making a decision about whether it's a good idea to use the funds in this way, or is our focus different than that?
No, basically, we're just basing our decision and making a recommendation on the financial capacity of the requesting municipality as to its capacity to repay the loan and to enter into the transaction as proposed.
And your conclusion is that the municipality of Carolina is capable of repaying this loan?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Ojeda? Thank you very much. I would like to ask for a motion to approve the issuance of new debt in the amount of $7,050,000 by the municipality of Carolina as presented by Mr. Ojeda. Will someone make that motion?
I move to approve the issuance of the debt.
Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Thank you. We have a motion and a second. Let's have a voice vote. All in favor, please say yes.
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 Anyone opposed? Thank you. The motion is approved. We now move to item 8 on our agenda, which is a discussion of Act 154. And this will again be Mr. Herman Ojeda, our Municipal Affairs and Legislative Review Director, presenting to us about Act 154.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair. Act 154 of 2010 is a very relevant statutory provision for the island, given that it involves the taxation of many entities within the manufacturing industry in Puerto Rico, which is a significant component of the island's economy and a significant source of income for the Puerto Rico government. Could we go to the next slide, please? So for those not too familiar with the topic, Act 154 is legislation that was approved in 2010, and it imposes a 4% excise tax on the sale of tangible personal property manufacturing Puerto Rico or services performed in Puerto Rico when the transactions exceed $75 million. The tax is paid not by the Puerto Rico entity, but by the foreign or U.S. affiliate. And as of today, it has become a very significant source of revenues for the Puerto Rico government, as I mentioned, representing approximately 20% of the general fund revenues. The significance of this act at this point evolves around the recent events of the U.S. tax reform in 2017, Tax Cut and Jobs Act, as well as a proposed regulation recently issued September 29th by the U.S. Treasury, which may impact the manufacturing industry in Puerto Rico. Next slide, please. So the Act 154 revenues, as I said, for FY20 accounted for $1.8 billion of the general fund revenues in Puerto Rico, and these revenues are expected to be affected negatively in the coming years as a result of many factors, some of which are mentioned on the lower left-hand side of the slide, such as patent expirations, or the provisions around the U.S. Tax reform. This impact, this potential impact, has been considered in the fiscal plan certified by the board, and it's important to note that these entities not only pay the 4% impact, which has been considered in the fiscal plan, but also contribute to the local economy in terms of other types of taxes, such as withholding taxes on royalty payments, corporate income tax, sales and use tax, excise tax, the income tax paid by the employees, Act 154 companies, or companies that pay the Act 154 tax, enable approximately 78,000 direct and indirect jobs in the island. So thus the importance of this revenue sector. Next slide, please. Act 154, as I have mentioned, is very important to the island's economy, and it's a provision that needs to be reviewed and out of which the Puerto Rico government needs to transition. So given the significance of this statutory provision, the transition has to be very carefully crafted and must involve not only the Puerto Rico government, but the parties involved, the manufacturing industry, as well as the U.S. parent companies or affiliates of the entities in Puerto Rico, as well as the U.S. government. The main feature of Act 154 is the fact that it may be creditable against the U.S. company's federal income tax liability. That means it's a dollar for dollar reduction of the U.S. tax liability of the paying entity. And to that effect, the U.S. Treasury Department back in 2011 issued a determination that the Act 154 tax, which, as I mentioned, is an excise tax, is creditable against the U.S. income tax liability of the U.S. entity. But that's something that we all know, we've known for many years, that we need to move away from. So we need to make an orderly transition out of this excise tax to replace, make sure that the Puerto Rico government is able to replace any revenues that may be lost, as well as promoting the retention and attraction of additional manufacturing activity into the island. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, one of the main factors affecting the tax position of the manufacturing industry in Puerto Rico in the last couple of years was the U.S. tax reform of 2017, which basically did away with a prior statutory provision allowing the deferral of revenues earned in Puerto Rico and provoked or brought in the current taxation of revenues derived by affiliates or subsidiaries doing businesses in Puerto Rico that to some extent impacted negatively the island's competitiveness and attractiveness for doing business as a manufacturing hub for these companies. So the other important element of the TCJA U.S. federal tax reform was a potential limitation on the creditability of the foreign taxes paid, which basically results in an increase in the effective tax rate of the U.S. affiliate that's paying the foreign tax, in this case, the 4% excise tax in Puerto Rico. Next slide, please. Guilty is the technical term for the type of income which prior to the TCJA was not subject to immediate taxation. That was the deferral that was allowed for U.S. income tax purposes when a parent company or an affiliate had operations in Puerto Rico through either a subsidiary or a separate affiliate. So GILTI, which is the new provision under the U.S. tax reform, as I mentioned, only allows 80% of the foreign taxes to be creditable against the U.S. tax liability, whereas prior to this provision, it was 100%. And it creates, GILTI basically create a less competitive business environment for Puerto Rico, to the extent that it also, that the U.S. tax reform also reduced the U.S. tax rate from 35 to 21%, and thus bringing businesses to Puerto Rico or to any other foreign jurisdiction all of a sudden was not so attractive for U.S. Manufacturing entities. Next slide, please. This is a numerical example of the GILTI computation. The other slide, this slide we're looking at now, represents a summary of the other recent event, the other recent issue that makes Act 154 important, given the potential disruption that may result from a proposed regulation issued last month by the U.S. Treasury, which, even though it is not directly aimed at affecting Act 154, the way it's drafted or written at the moment, if approved, it may significantly limit the creditability of the Act 154 taxes paid by the U.S. entity to Puerto Rico, thus resulting in an actual increase in the effective tax rate to companies doing businesses in Puerto Rico. This proposed regulation is currently undergoing a review and public comment period. The Puerto Rico Treasury Department, Puerto Rico government, has been actively in conversations with the U.S. Treasury to ascertain that this proposed regulation does not immediately impact the island's revenues, which are, again, significant component of the general fund revenues, and that an orderly transition is permitted within the next 2 or 3 years for Puerto Rico to move away from the Act 154 excise tax into some other type of taxation structure, which allows the retention and attraction of additional manufacturing activity into the island. Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
The next slide seems to be missing. Just walk through it.
Oh, okay. So basically the proposal is to given this current scenario, the proposal is for the Oversight Board, together with the Puerto Rico Treasury Department, the DDEC, Department of Economic Development and Commerce, and AFAF, to work together, create working groups, engage with representatives from the local companies which may be impacted by these changes or potential changes to Act 154, to come together, work together, communicate and maintain open lines of communication with the U.S. Treasury, with the U.S. IRS, and explore alternatives that may result in beneficial for both the Puerto Rico government, the companies, as well as minimizing the impact to the U.S. revenue. Any comments, Natalie, or any questions from any of the board members? I'll be more than happy to elaborate further.
Can you talk through, I just want to understand just kind of exactly what we're looking at here. Can you talk through the kind of first of all, what's happened to date in terms of whether any of these corporations have already changed their activity? What's how the kind of current uncertainty is affecting the extent to which folks are moving new products to Puerto Rico? And then the last piece is, can you talk through a bit of the kind of the contractual structure that Puerto Rico has with companies that have already that are already doing business on the island, and how that interplays with the ability to work through transitions?
Absolutely. Thank you. First of all, I have to say that we are aware of one entity which, as of early this year, already did transition or did make some changes to its operational structure in Puerto Rico. Basically, it involved the transfer of a production line from Puerto Rico because of increased costs of doing business on the island, the potential that the Act 154 excise tax may not end up being creditable at all against the U.S. tax liability. We've also heard from Puerto Rico government representatives and company representatives as well. They're concerned that under the current structure, it may not be feasible for certain types of the manufacturing entities. And this affects differently those engaged in, for example, pharma, biotech, the medical devices. This affects differently each sector depending on the type of assets and activities that they bring into the island. So we've heard from some companies already that the attractiveness of bringing new lines of production to Puerto Rico is being impacted by the uncertainty created by what's going to happen with Act 154. In terms of the local tax structure under which these companies operate, they usually operate under what we call a tax exemption decree, which is a contract which they enter into with the Puerto Rico government, which provides the basic tax structure that will be applicable based to the Puerto Rico operation, usually based on manufacturing jobs and the technology that's brought into the island. As a general rule, this tax exemption decrees provide for tax rates of approximately 2 to 4%, as well as exemption on some other taxes such as property tax, excise tax, sales and use tax, and some others.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think it'd be helpful to get some additional kind of sensitivity analysis for our revenue projections included in the included in the fiscal plan. I know we've been having some version of this discussion since the inception of the board, and I'm concerned that even the current assumption that we have that assumes that we are going to be successful in doing a transition to a new tax structure may be too optimistic. So it'd be helpful to do some sensitivity analysis around kind of what we are, to make sure that we're comfortable that that assumption in the fiscal plan really truly reflects the level of risk that we face here, given how big a piece this is to funding Puerto Rico services.
All right. Noted.
And I see we have a question from Mr. Marrero, a question or questions or comments. Mr. Marrero?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I have a few questions before doing some comments. I just want to clarify the record. Once again, Juan Marrero for the record. I know that in page 38 of the presentation, I think that we, at the end of the right, at the end or at the bottom the right side of the slide says any reform must be implemented in a careful and thoughtful fashion. And I think this is very important because even though we are discussing having this conversation today, it looks like it is happening at the end of the term. But it's very important for the people of Puerto Rico to understand that since the beginning, since 2017, we identify, as opposed to any other administration that decided to look other way, since 2017, we have been working with the Treasury on this matter. Something that I want to clarify before I get into my statement is in the next slide, in page 39, it says that the companies will have to voluntarily agree to a tax increase that violates the decree. And this is something important. It is not that they will voluntarily agree, it's that any change to a tax decree, which is a contract between that company and the government of Puerto Rico, must meet that test that the tax is not voluntarily paid. So this is something important. It's not that they're going to agree to a tax voluntarily. It has to understood that this tax is not voluntarily paid because if not, it can run afoul of the credit. So that's something that I wanted to highlight. And the last slide that says that we need to accelerate, that we need to partner and to explore. Again, any innocent eye or a naive or experienced eye that look at this, it could conclude that the government of Puerto Rico has not been on top of this. And this is something important that, again, Mr. Chairman, it is very important that we highlight the fact that we have been working on this since day one. As I stated the last time that we all met publicly to discuss this topic in August, I described how during the past 3 years and a half, almost 4 years, the government of Puerto Rico has been actively working with the Treasury Department on this matter, the White House, as well as Congress, not only in this matter, in a plethora of federal tax issues that could impact Puerto Rico's economy and obviously recovery efforts, and obviously the restructuring process. This is one of the areas that we have, since day one, we have requested the strong collaboration, not only of the federal government, the oversight board, and also the companies. Our efforts in DC began, as I said, amidst the early negotiations regarding the federal tax reform and the eventual enactment of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Since then, we have been diligently working in a non-partisan basis, not only locally, but also nationally, on the issue of the Puerto Rico excise tax as enacted under Act 154/2010, because as we have seen in the presentation and all the information that we have shared, the Treasury, Congress, White House, and also the Oversight Board, it is clear the importance of this revenue for the people of Puerto Rico and the government of Puerto Rico. On September 29, 2020, a couple of weeks ago, the IRS published a notice of proposed rulemaking, Regulation -101-657-2020, which proposes new regulations in relation to the new definition with respect to foreign income tax and taxes paid in lieu of an income tax. As soon as they were published, we promptly analyzed the contents and coordinated a working session with the high-ranking officials of the Treasury Department, same way that we have done it in the last 2 years and a half. As you may recall, the Secretary of Hacienda, Secretary Perez, who I have to comment on this matter because he has been on top and been working very diligently with this matter, he immediately issued within 48 hours a press release after the regulations were published, detailing our findings, preliminary findings, as well as a result of meetings and calls that we had with the Treasury, which I summarized for the benefit of this oversight board, as well as the people of Puerto Rico and all the people that are listening to this meeting. First of all, the Treasury confirmed unequivocally that the regulations were not intended to defeat the Puerto Rico excise tax and were intended to address a major concern regarding the digital taxes imposed in Europe and other parts of the world, and that the Treasury of the United States of America has been currently subsidizing. Furthermore, Treasury confirmed that the Act 154 tax is not the type of tax that the proposed regulations intend to address, and that Notice 2011-29, issued almost 10 years ago, remains all unaltered and in effect. And this is something important because one day after the regulation were published, an Assistant Secretary of the Treasury said publicly that this was not aimed at this type of tax. So they agree that products manufactured in Puerto Rico are produced in U.S. soil, that jobs in Puerto Rico are American jobs, and that Puerto Rican workers are American workers. Make no mistake, this is part of the United States of America. And the Treasury agreed that there is a clear distinction to be made between taxes paid in Puerto Rico vis-a-vis other foreign tax jurisdictions. They were also pleased to hear our progress in coming coming up with a potential substitute system to replace the 154 tax. However, it is important to remember that this cannot happen overnight. It is not an easy tax, obviously, and we will propose a substitute which will require proper vetting and approval from the U.S. Treasury. And let me pause there. When the notice in 2011 was issued by the U.S. Treasury Department, it was not done in a vacuum. It was done in a collaborative way between the Puerto Rico government, the federal government, as well as our other stakeholders. On that note, Treasury agreed that a change of this nature requires an orderly transition. And I'm glad that Herman highlighted that in his presentation, because that's what we're looking for. We just need an orderly transition that will not trump the efforts of the federal government to bring manufacturing to Puerto Rico, as well as the efforts of the Puerto Rico government to maintain our current tax base. So on that note, they agree that this will require a transition that would allow both the companies and the government to convert to a system in an orderly fashion. In that light, the Treasury confirmed that the notice and the current tax treatment will be extended for a period until a proper transition can occur. The Treasury Department has assured that the proposed regulations will not go into effect until some time after the comment period is completed. And obviously, Puerto Rico will be granted time not only to submit the comment, but also after the comment period is completed, we'll work with the Treasury in alternatives to protect our economy and to continue to attract manufacturing and to foster job creation in Puerto Rico. That's what we want, and that's what we're going to be working for. Moreover, they agreed that a distinction must be made on the way the tax operates in Puerto Rico when compared to the taxes by other jurisdictions. Again, we have already begun technical discussions, not only with the Treasury Department, but also with the different companies, and we'll submit our comments to the proposed regulations to make sure that once we have finalized that review and analysis, the Treasury Department can take it into consideration. Again, we feel confident that we have been able to establish a strong working relationship with the Treasury Department, the companies, the oversight board as well, that would allow us to properly transition into this new tax system in a responsible manner. Again, in the past, I know that this board has made clear its position that Puerto Rico must shift away from the PREP into a new tax system. But be mindful that changing that Puerto Rico entire tax system is not a simple task, cannot be done overnight. At least we don't have that magic wand. It involves multiple jurisdictional players with different corporate structure that, as you know, is not determined only taking Puerto Rico into consideration, but also the global profile of that company. US-based entities operate in the midst of a complicated set of international tax rules that were further complicated by the 2017 federal tax reform. Conversely, European-based companies also have presence on the island and are subject to a totally tax regime. We have held over 50 meetings with the U.S. Treasury and leading Act 154 companies. Over 50 of those were technical sessions with the companies to discuss the current state of play regarding federal taxes, federal laws, regulations that affect all of them in their businesses on the island. We have been transparent, and we will continue to do so from the beginning in signaling that changes in international taxation may force Puerto Rico to change our current tax system. I'm finishing. The importance of the PREP cannot be understated. It represents 20% of Puerto Rico general fund revenues. We have collaborated side by side with the companies and the Treasury to explore ideas regarding changes to Puerto Rico's current tax structure. We do so fully cognizant of the fact that any swift changes in legislation may significantly impact the tax structure and revenue collection of Puerto Rico government as soon in the next fiscal year. In addition, Puerto Rico is competing with a number of jurisdictions that look to attract manufacturing operations by actively providing tax incentives and benefits. The OECD has also been active in working on the rules that need to be further examined by all stakeholders. Any changes, again, in legislation need to recognize these complexities and certain options that will favorably position Puerto Rico as a place of doing business in a competitive and evolving global landscape. We have made progress, and we will continue to collaborate in the meetings with the 154 taxpayers and to work to find a more permanent and equitable solution that does not threaten Puerto Rico tax base, and even more importantly, the more than 75,000 direct and indirect jobs generated by the companies impacted by this change. This is critical to the Puerto Rico economic recovery. It's critical for a successful restructuring, and that's what we're looking for. Most recently, we have supported the enactment of the federal tax legislation that incentivizes manufacturing operations in the island. We're all in agreement. We have been collaborating with Peter Navarro. We have been collaborating with Peter Brown. We are collaborating with the White House, and we will continue to do so. And we have seen the willingness and commitment from the federal government and Congress to look for ways to incentivize manufacturing activity in Puerto Rico and strengthen the U.S. medical supply chains. If Congress decides to include any tax provision on the next stimulus package regarding the strengthening of the U.S. medical supply, Puerto Rico is well positioned to contribute and address this national need. We look forward to continue our meetings with the companies and the Treasury. We're confident the Puerto Rico government will be in a position in the near future to unveil a final design, which we have been designing, developing, of a substitute tax framework that will optimize revenues as well as job creation and preservation on the island. Mr. Chairman, we expect no less than strong collaboration from the Oversight Board in that respect, and I'm convinced that we will be able to move forward on this important issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Marrero. And I see Mr. Peterson has questions or comments that he would like to contribute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make a comment that I was really pleased to see this on the agenda. It's an issue, as Mr. Marrero said, of critical importance to Puerto Rico. I would also add, just underscore that it's of critical importance to President Trump's agenda of bringing jobs and manufacturing back from China to Puerto Rico. So, you know, we definitely need to act on this. I appreciate Mr. Marrero's comments and all that he and the Commonwealth are doing. And I just want to state in response to your request that we collaborate. I could not agree more. And I would want you and the current administration and the next administration to consider me at your disposal to helping get this done. And this is a critical matter of economic development, as you said. It's also a critical matter of self-governance. And this is something that Puerto Rico can handle. Puerto Rico can help lead in transitioning to a new format. And I want to do whatever I can to be of assistance and support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Any other questions or comments from the board?
Just wondering if we can expect faster progress on this than on the CAFRs. I'm reminded of the fact that, our former board member, Carlos Garcia, was with the administration and was critical to formulating the first tax. And since our first meeting, I think we've been talking about this issue and the need to transition. I think a lot of you have spoken about the commitment to transparency, and transparency on this in terms of what you're thinking about as the proposed solution would be really critical so that we can try to be helpful, because I agree with everybody. This is a critically important issue and critically important to being able to provide services in Puerto Rico. So.
Thank you, Ms. Montes. Any other questions or comments from the board? Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Ojeda and others. Why don't we move to the next item on our agenda, which is section 313 of PROMESA and the Commonwealth Plan of Adjustment and a proposed modification of the Plan of Adjustment. And Mr. Resco is going to talk about that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As everyone is aware, in February of 2020, the board filed a modified plan of adjustment with the court. And just a few weeks later, the first case of COVID had reached the island. On March 16th, 2020, through an executive order, the governor of Puerto Rico ordered a coronavirus lockdown. And when it became obvious that the sheer scope of this global pandemic would change the reality of Puerto Rico's economy, we asked the U.S. District Court for the District of Puerto Rico to halt the approval process for the plan to allow the Oversight Board to assess the effect of COVID-19 on the health of the people as well as on the economy of the island. We will now share a snapshot of the effects of COVID-19 on the Puerto Rican economy to date with a presentation from Ricardo Fuentes, our resident economist at the Oversight Board. His presentation will show why it is that the board asked the court and the court approved to halt the approval process for the proposed plan of adjustment. What was true in February 2020 is no longer true in October of 2020. Ricardo?
Thank you, Mr. Orozco. Next slide, please. So the US and Puerto Rican economies were in very, very different circumstances when they were impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. While the US was impacted by COVID when it was experiencing the longest expansion in US history, the PR economy was impacted by COVID amid a secular decline in economic activity that has not relented since fiscal year 2007. As of fiscal year 2019, Puerto Rico's real GNP has contracted approximately 20% since the secular decline began in fiscal year 07. The Puerto Rican economy was also impacted by the hurricanes and the earthquakes, worsening this contraction in economic activity just prior to the impact of COVID-19. While the Puerto Rican economy will benefit from federal stimulus related to the government response to the pandemic, this will not impact the structural factors that are driving this downward trajectory. As such, the expectation is that federal stimulus will offset the negative trend briefly during fiscal year 21, thereafter returning to negative growth. In sum, there is little doubt that the Puerto Rican economy was in a drastically weaker state relative to the US economy when the pandemic hit. It's useful to note the impact that the Great Recession had on the PR economy relative to the US economy. So for example, the Great Recession was felt much more severely in Puerto Rico. While the US economy was already back in positive growth by 2010, the Puerto Rican economy did not see positive growth until fiscal year 2012. And in this fiscal year, it only grew 0.5%, only to immediately return to a negative growth trajectory the year after in fiscal year 2013. Next slide, please. Unemployment in Puerto Rico is also structurally higher relative to the US. So across different measures of unemployment, Puerto Rico has remained structurally higher prior to and throughout the pandemic. The Puerto Rican economy's weaker labor market implies that this post-pandemic recovery will be much slower than in the US, and there's already evidence from the labor data that we've been gathering during the past months that this is the case. Next slide, please. So for example, looking at a limited sample of Puerto Rico payroll data that is weighted more towards food service and accommodations, we see that the number of employees on payroll is still 33% below pre-COVID baseline compared to 22% in the US. Next slide, please. Looking at BLS data, or the Bureau of Labor Statistics, on average, the job recovery for Puerto Rico has been slower than in the US. So in Puerto Rico, 39% of the jobs lost in April were recovered by August, compared to 52% in the US. Leisure and hospitality has been one of the hardest hit sectors in Puerto Rico, with 43% of employment lost in April, or approximately 35,000 jobs. Only a third of the lost jobs were recovered by August. During this same time frame, the US has already recovered about 64% of the lost jobs. Construction lost about 10,000 jobs in April and has recovered about half of these by August, and this compares to a recovery of 117% of the lost jobs in the mainland US. Next slide, please. Above all, Puerto Rico has a substantially higher poverty rate than the US, and this will also contribute to a slower recovery. According to the US Census Bureau, only 8.6% of US families were under the poverty line in 2019. Now this compares to 39.5% of families in the case of Puerto Rico. The island is also significantly poorer than the poorest US state, Mississippi, where 14.8% of families were under the poverty level. Puerto Rico also has a higher proportion of families living just above the poverty line, or at 125% of the poverty level. In the US, 3.2% of families found themselves living only slightly above the poverty line, compared to 8.8% of families in Puerto Rico. Now, the evidence that many of these Puerto Rican families may have already fallen below the poverty level, as evidenced in the recent spike in participants in Puerto Rico's nutritional assistance program. The percentage of total population participating in NAP rose from 43% in January 2020 to 50% in September 2020 due to the pandemic. and this will also contribute to a much slower recovery in the case of Puerto Rico. The floor is yours, Ms. Yaresco.
Thank you, Ricardo. And it's within this new context that we will now present to you the following recommendation for immediate commencement of negotiations with creditors and other parties under the current mediation agreement, consistent with the modifications that we will outline shortly, with a view to the filing of an amended plan of adjustment as soon as practically possible. If I could, I'd like to invite William Everts to speak from PJT.
Thank you, Ms. Jaresco. I'm William Everts, and I'm here with my colleague, Steve Zellen, partner and head of PJT Partners Restructuring and Special Situations Group. As a reminder, the board filed an amended plan of adjustment in February 2020 to restructure approximately $35 billion of debt and other claims against the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. That plan reflected a revised plan support agreement with certain bondholders of the Commonwealth. The February plan was the result of months of mediation with the Commonwealth stakeholders, including creditor groups and the Commonwealth itself. The February plan had nearly $11 billion of creditors supporting the plan, or 60% of all GO and PPA holders. Since that time, however, as described by Mr. Fuentes, the COVID-19 pandemic has changed the economic reality across the world and in Puerto Rico. In light of that development, the board reevaluated the plan support agreement. The board re-engaged with creditors and their advisors in formal mediation in August and exchanged proposals that were subsequently disclosed publicly on September 30th. Since then, the board and its advisors have worked to develop an amended plan structure that reflects the effect of the deepening economic crisis post-COVID and the uncertainty that results from the ongoing pandemic. The outlines of this proposal that we'll walk through in these pages are largely similar to the August 18th proposal that the Commonwealth disclosed publicly, with the notable exception of an additional contingent value instrument, or CVI. The proposal consists of, in brief summary, approximately $6 billion in cash, approximately $5 billion of general obligation bonds, which is $4.4 billion lower than the February filed plan, and a contingent value instrument limited to a lifetime payout of $1 billion. As Natalie mentioned, under the approach outlined in these pages, the board would first engage with creditors in the near term on the structure of this plan, and shortly thereafter file a revised plan of adjustment as soon as practicably possible. Moving to the next page. This slide presents a comparison of total consideration under each of the February 2020 filed plan of adjustment, the two proposals disclosed publicly on September 30th, and the proposed adjusted plan that I discussed on the previous page. The chart represents total consideration adjusted for a consistent effective date of a plan of adjustment. So for these purposes, we have assumed an exit from bankruptcy of July 1st, 2021. There are three salient points to highlight in this comparison. First, as I noted before, the decline in total consideration, and specifically pro forma debt, reflects the board's concern regarding affordability and sustainability of a plan of adjustment after the COVID-19 pandemic. Second, as you can see in both the February 9th filed plan and the August 24th creditor counter, a light blue bar. That represents the COFINA Junior bond issuance. Importantly, the proposed adjusted plan does not have those secured bonds, but instead reflects a 100% general obligation structure. Lastly, the main adjustment for this proposed plan of adjustment relative to the August 18th counter can be seen in the gray dotted box at the top of the bar all the way on the right. That is the $1 billion payout to which the CVI is capped. Moving to the next page. This graph shows on a yearly basis total debt service required, including both the already restructured COFINA bonds and the debt service associated with this proposed plan of adjustment. As you can see, the lower total debt service requirements are limited to $1.05 billion. That number compares to $1.47 billion under the February plan of adjustment. which is reflected in the red dotted line at the top of the graph. This plan also maintains the 20-year tenor of debt consideration and the revised coupon structure that reflects current municipal market conditions and has been reduced relative to the February plan. Moving to the next page, this proposal includes, as I mentioned before, a CVI as incremental consideration to the previous proposal. The table at the top right summarizes the key features of the CVI that we want to explain to the board. The CVI is based on the 5.5% sales and use tax, the collections of which are reported consistent with the post-restructured COFINA bonds. This structure, we believe, provides reporting transparency to the market in a structure and revenue source that the market already understands. The CVI is structured such that it only receives payments in the event of outperformance of sales and use tax collections above the 2020 certified fiscal plan projections. So under this structure, creditors would receive 40% of that outperformance, with the Commonwealth keeping 60% of that outperformance. In other words, if the 5.5% sales and use tax increases by $1 relative to the previous fiscal plan, the CVI would receive 40 cents. The CVI is also subject to caps. In this case, a lifetime cap of $1 billion and a yearly cap of $50 million per year. This structure would continue for the same tenor as the hard debt service. In other words, through fiscal 2041. Additionally, and importantly, the CVI obligation would also be a general obligation of the Commonwealth. We've included a visualization of this structure at the bottom of the chart. The red line, sort of through the middle of it, reflects the 2020 fiscal plan projections for the 5.5% sales and use tax. The top part, the sort of black line of the graph, reflects 2% outperformance relative to that. Obviously, that's hypothetical, and as that outperformance is not known at this time. So what this shows is that the creditors would receive the lower of 40% of the outperformance, or $50 million on an annual basis. In summary, the CVI has the benefit of not increasing additional required annual debt service to the Commonwealth. However, should sales and use tax projections outperform projections by virtue of the sharing structure that we have, the Commonwealth would also receive incremental revenues to make those payments and also receive additional dollars into the general fund. Moving to the next page. The proposed recoveries have been reduced commensurate with the total consideration that's been offered. Those sort of recoveries by class have been laid out. You can see on the left, each class is listed in order. And then across the sort of table, we've shown the recovery in the February 9th filed plan of adjustment. And then two columns on the right. The first column reflects recoveries if the plan of adjustment didn't receive any payment on account of the CVI. And then the payment all the way on the right reflects a full payment on the CVI. So that's the difference between the right two columns. In addition, all the way at the bottom, you see the adjustment in consideration that unsecured creditors receive in the plan. Importantly, and lastly to note in terms of the relative distribution of recoveries between GO and PBA classes, the proposed plan does not alter the relative discounts among those classes, which were negotiated as part of the February plan support agreement. At this point, I'll turn it back to Mr. Esco.
Thank you. You can go to the next slide. If I may, I'm going to ask Juan Santambrogio from E&Y to walk through for everyone how we get to the number 5984 or almost $6 billion of cash, and where we start and how we get to that number and what the cash accounts represent. Juan, are you with us?
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Natalie. My name is Juan Santambrogio, and I'm a managing director with EY, and I am joined by Gaurav Malhotra, head of the U.S. restructuring practice. In this slide, we can see that of the estimated 24 billion in cash and investments as of June 30th, 2020, in more than 2,000 bank accounts held by the central government and by the public corporations, approximately 10 billion is available to fund plan of adjustment obligations, and approximately 14 billion is expected to be unavailable. The unavailable cash can be classified into three large buckets. There is 7.4 billion in cash that belongs to public corporations. If we go to the next slide, you can see the list of these agencies holding these account balances. Many of these entities have separate fiscal plans and their own debt obligations, like PREPA, PRASA, COFINA, the University of Puerto Rico, and the Highway and Transportation Authority. Others are independent public corporations, including the Health Insurance Administration, the State Insurance Fund, the Automobile Accident Compensation Administration, and the Infrastructure Financing Authority, among others. The second bucket is estimated at 5.4 billion in Commonwealth accounts that are considered restricted. These restrictions were determined by the Oversight Board's legal counsel. The details by agency and type of restrictions are in slide 9. So if we can go to slide 9. One more, yeah. The type of restrictions include court orders, federal funds, funds restricted by federal law, third-party funds, bond proceeds, and third-party contracts. About 3.8 billion of this amount is related to CARES Act funds received by Hacienda that had not been dispersed as of June 30th, 2020. If we go back to slide 7, the third bucket totals 894 million that is assumed to be unavailable. The details by agency are in slide 10. If we can go to slide 10. The largest amounts in this category are related to unemployment funds, lottery funds, and certain accounts that did not meet the minimum threshold for review for having cash balances lower than 7 million. If we can go back to slide 7. There are also 357 million of timing adjustments as of June 30th, 2020, mostly related to revenues that were deferred from fiscal year 20 to fiscal year 21 as a result of the pandemic. Finally, the amount to be segregated for the emergency reserve is 650 million. That leaves about 10 billion available as of June 30th, 2020. This balance is projected to grow in fiscal year 21 as a result of the projected fiscal plan surplus and the interest income on existing cash, to a total of about 10.5 billion as of the end of fiscal year 21. The plan of adjustment upfront consideration includes almost 6 billion to financial creditors, 1.5 billion for the segregation of individual retirement accounts for System 2000 participants, and 648 million for union and retiree payments, including contributions to the pension trust, union payments, and additional employer healthcare contributions. After this plan of adjustment payments, the remaining unrestricted cash at the Commonwealth is projected to be close to the 2.5 billion minimum cash requirement. As we combine the available cash with the projected surpluses in the certified fiscal plan and the estimated creditor payments, we are presenting 3 scenarios for the 30-year cash projections based on the proposed plan of adjustment. Scenario 1 in this slide reflects the certified fiscal plan projections adjusted for additional items already negotiated or under negotiation with certain creditor groups. The first row highlighted in black shows the certified fiscal plan unrestricted surplus or deficit on an annual basis. And in the last 3 columns, we can see the totals for 10 years, 20 years, and 30 years of projections. You will see that the 10-year projected surplus is 4.3 billion. The next 2 rows show the cash required to service the proposed new debt using a 1.05 billion maximum annual debt service cap, including debt service of approximately 5 billion in the first 10 years and 441 million to fund the debt reserve account. The next section incorporates certain adjustments not included in the fiscal plan projections. These are the proposed increases in employer healthcare contributions to $170 per employee per month, potential concessions to unions, an increase in the pension threshold from $1,200 per month to $1,500 per month, which would result in fewer retirees being impacted by the proposed pension benefit cuts and the proposed contributions to the pension trust. After these adjustments, the 10-year projected deficit after debt service is about 3.6 billion. If we focus on the second part of the table, we see in fiscal year 21 the same available cash balance of 10 billion from the previous slide. Then the plan of adjustment payments are subtracted to arrive at the 2.3 billion, which was mentioned previously. From there, we roll forward the fiscal plan annual surpluses or deficits to estimate the projected cash balance. The cash balance in this scenario at the end of 10 years shows a cash deficit of 1.1 billion and a shortfall of 3.6 billion after considering the minimum level of cash of 2.5 billion, implying that the government would have to identify additional revenue sources or implement additional cost savings above and beyond those projected in the fiscal plan to be able to fund its operating expenditures and its long-term obligations. If we go to the next slide. Scenario 2 has one modification as compared to scenario 1, which is to use a more updated macroeconomic forecast for the fiscal plan projection based on more recent CBO forecasts published in July and September. The financial impact of the updated economic assumptions is 4 billion in additional surpluses in the first 10 years and 12.6 billion in 30 years. Even under this more favorable economic growth scenario, based on a CBO forecast that was released prior to the most recent peak in COVID cases, the 10-year projections result in a 0.5 billion deficit. From a cash perspective, this scenario would be affordable in the first 10 years with an estimated ending cash balance of 2 billion, but still would result in cash deficits in the outer years. It is important to note that this scenario is not free of implementation risk. The certified fiscal plan includes fiscal measures and structural reforms totaling 9 billion in the first 10 years and approximately 47 billion in the 30-year period. For this scenario to be affordable, the government would have to implement 100% of the fiscal measures and the structural reforms outlined in the fiscal plan. We go to the next slide. Scenario 3, similar to scenario 2, assumes a more recent and favorable CBO economic forecast. It also shows the potential downside financial impact if the fiscal plan measures and the structural reforms in the fiscal plan are not implemented. The first 5 rows in the middle section list the fiscal measures included in the fiscal plan and their estimated financial impact. And the last 4 rows in that section include the structural reforms and their estimated financial impact for an estimated total impact of about 47 billion in the 30-year period. This scenario would cause a cash deficit as early as 2024 and would result in a 10-year cash deficit of 6.9 billion and a shortfall of 9.4 billion after taking into account the minimum required cash balance. These collective fiscal measures and structural reforms are based on future actions that need to be undertaken in order to achieve the forecasted cost savings and revenue increases in the fiscal plan. Back to you, Natalie.
Thank you, Juan. Mr. Chair and board members, the reason we showed you the different scenarios is because there are upsides and there are downsides that we need to take into account with regard to the fiscal plan. We've shown you 2 different parts of that. As you know, This board has consistently and constantly made all efforts to come to consensual agreements on a sustainable restructuring of the liabilities of the Commonwealth. We came to a consensual agreement on the profiling of PRASA. We came to a consensual agreement on the restructuring of GDB. We came to a consensual agreement on the restructuring of COFINA. And in this process at the Commonwealth, we reached consensual agreements with the Committee of Retirees, or CORE, with the Servidores Públicos Unidos, AFSCME union, and with creditors on the plan support agreements that have been filed in September of last year and February of this year that evidence that good faith. COVID was something that no one expected, no one could have predicted, and it has hit this island's economy when the economy was already down, already reeling from more than a decade of recession, the effect of historically damaging hurricanes, substantial political uncertainty, and then a rash of earthquakes, which have not yet ceased to rock the southwest region of this island, and where children have been out of school since January of this year alone. The economy can recover, it must recover, and ending bankruptcy is one of the critical steps of recovery and ending the uncertainty. But ending bankruptcy alone, as I discussed with Mr. Peterson earlier, is one of the critical steps. Alone, it will not cause a rush of new investment of billions of dollars onto the island. Alone, it will not cause economic growth. It is a critical step, but the implementation of the structural reforms that we talked about earlier and that are included in this fiscal plan projection that result in growth and result in these revenues is also equally important to both. So ending bankruptcy is definitely a critical step. Given where Puerto Rico's economy is post-COVID and what we believe to be sustainable, I recommend the board consider the following resolution. Resolved, the board authorizes the immediate commencement of negotiations with creditors and other parties under the current mediation agreement, consistent with the proposals contained in Exhibit 4, which we have just shown in detail, hereto, with a view to the filing of an amended plan of adjustment as soon as practically possible. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Jaresko and everyone. We have a motion that we'll consider once we've had questions and comments. So I'd like to turn to the board for any questions, comments, or discussion. And I see Mr. Peterson has questions or comments, or both.
Thank you. Well, I want to make a few comments on this, and you know, depending on where the discussion goes, I'll probably have questions. The first thing I'd say is I think it's absolutely a good thing that we're talking about moving forward on a deal or moving towards a deal with the Commonwealth bondholders. As many of you know, I've been making that point. I've not been shy about it. And it's because I believe that ending bankruptcy is what's ultimately going to help attract investment, new capital, along with the economic development items that we spoke of earlier, and help the island grow. And I think I come at this a little bit differently than others may, and that is I come at this from a vantage point of growing the pie instead of figuring out what we can do with the pie that we have. I think that that's really the view that's necessary to move past bankruptcy. And so I think that that's why in order for negotiations, in order for a deal to be had, negotiations and the process has got to be consensual. It's got to be conducted in good faith. I oppose this structure because I think it's neither. I want to read something from Judge Swain's ruling from the other day, which I think we should all take note of. In developing the amended plan of adjustment, the Oversight Board and relevant stakeholders are encouraged to negotiate responsibly and in good faith. So I think, again, good thing that we're moving forward and we're orienting around doing a deal. That's a change and that's a good thing. But what she says about acting consensually and acting in good faith, I think we need to take a look at that and where this stands. To me, as I look at this structure, First thing I'd say about it is it's inequitable. The second thing I'd say about it is that it is non-consensual. And the third thing I would say about it, it was not developed responsibly or in good faith. And let me go through each one of those and why I believe what I believe. First of all, it's inequitable because it, in spite of this doom and gloom forecast on the state of the economy, which again is not a growth mentality, which is where I think we need to be. It gives more money to stakeholders who have been getting paid and takes away money from bondholders who have never been paid throughout this process. I think that's inequitable, and I don't think it's consensual. And so the second thing, why is this not consensual? You know, first, I think it disregards priorities. We can debate that. I don't think this board has ever taken priorities seriously, but that's my opinion. I know that's been the subject of litigation, but this really goes beyond that because it treats bondholders in a way that, again, takes money from them. When they were at the table in February, they're ready to do a deal. The board said, sorry, we can't do a deal, there's COVID. But now what we're going to do is we're going to give a bunch more money to other stakeholders and we're going to reduce what's going to you. And again, these are people that have never been paid. We can debate about, and it's not my job, our negotiators and our staff, or excuse me, our consultants, our advisors will be debating with their advisors on what is doable. But the fact of the matter is they're getting nothing. And we have groups out there like the UCC running up tens of millions of dollars to the board, and they're getting, and their people are getting paid. They're not impaired. So I don't think this is consensual. Number three, I don't believe this was developed responsibly or in good faith. What do I mean by that? Please don't anybody take it personally. But I don't believe that it was, because in my view, this was rushed in order to create a baseline of more money to other stakeholders before a new board is in place. And let's face it, within a very short amount of time, we're going to have a new board. We're going to have new board members. And so I think that this ignores that fact. By pushing this forward so quickly, it ignores that. Now, I am going to vote against this motion today, not because I'm against consensual negotiations beginning, but because of everything I just said. This is inequitable, it's non-consensual, it was not developed responsibly or in good faith, in my opinion. Others may disagree. I want to point out that I had other tools at my disposal to prevent this motion from taking place, giving our bylaws and giving quorum rules. I didn't want to do that because I don't want to blow up the process. And I mean what I say when I say that we should get deals done. But the fact of the matter is that we got to do them consensually. This deal is a breach of contract. It will be litigated. It will delay the process. And do you know who suffers? The people of Puerto Rico. The people of Puerto Rico are suffering because we're not getting deals done. So I think that in my view, we should turn this into more of a term sheet, sit down with creditors, sit down with other stakeholders, work out a plan with them. That's not the way this is going to go. I'll probably be outvoted 3-1. But again, we're going to have new board members soon. And I just would say to all stakeholders out there, not to treat this structure as anything more than a blank canvas, because that's all it is. It's a starting point. I yield my time.
Thank you. I'd like to just say a couple quick things by way of reply and then invite other board members to comment. One is, I hope you'll consider stopping using the word not good faith, the expression not good faith. I believe everything that we have done from day one has absolutely been in good faith in an effort to fulfill our obligations under PROMESA. You can disagree with me. I don't take it personally one way or another, but I think it's just an inaccurate use of words to suggest that we're not acting in good faith. Two other quick things. One is those of us who were on the original board, our terms expired a year ago. So if we were waiting for a new board to be put in place, we never would have done anything. And I think it's really important that the board keep moving forward. Maybe there'll be a new board tomorrow. Maybe there won't be a new board or new board members for another 6 months. This process is going to take a while. Even if this proposal that's on the table really proves attractive to everyone, it's not going to be confirmed tomorrow. And if there is a new board anytime soon, they'll have time to weigh in on it. The new governor will have time to weigh in on it. So there's plenty of time for people to express their views and to discuss what is on the table. So those are just a few comments. Other board members have thoughts?
If I can just respond. I appreciate that. I don't intend for anybody to take what I'm saying personally. It's not personal, it's business. So I'm calling things like I see them. And so I just want to make that point. And so I believe everybody has the best intentions, but I still want to deal in reality. And the reality is that we're not going, this structure is not going to go anywhere because it's going to be viewed as a breach of contract. It will be immediately litigated and it'll bog the process down. And again, who suffers? The people of Puerto Rico suffer. The people of Puerto Rico should have the right to self-govern. They shouldn't have this board over them in perpetuity. And that's why I want to get deals done. Thank you.
Absolutely. I completely agree that the sooner that we finish our job and that the board can be disbanded, the better off for the people of Puerto Rico. Other comments or questions or thoughts from the board?
I have some questions. I wanted to, Ricardo, can you remind me the number of people that you mentioned were living in poverty in Puerto Rico today?
So right now it's approximately 40% of families.
What's the rate of child poverty?
It's even higher. Off the top of my head, I don't know the exact figure, but it's closer to 50% or above. But it is even more significant than the regular poverty rate. It is the highest child poverty rate across the U.S.
And this is looking at poverty rates with the regular poverty measure, not the supplemental poverty measure that would take into consideration other elements like the cost of housing in Puerto Rico and cost of food based on everything that's imported and all the rest, and cost of utilities, all of those other components, right? So this is the base one. Yep. The supplemental one is substantially higher, correct?
Correct. That is correct.
Got it. Can you remind me? So say I was 5 years old in September. Let's call it September 19th of 2017. How many weeks of school have I missed in the last 3 years?
Close to a year of school. The sum of the weeks is close to a year of school that's been lost.
Can we? So I'm just trying to make sure that I'm kind of thinking through if I'm, kind of was a 5-year-old in Yabucoa. I had Maria. Then how many consecutive days of shaking did we have during the earthquake period?
I don't have the exact number of consecutive days. Apologies.
But it was about a month, right?
Yes, definitely. So they started at end of year, and they went. Well, the South is still having aftershocks, so it has been a long and emotional toll on the South as well. Yes.
Thank you. Gaurav, can you remind me what the total of the measures? Juan spoke to about $9 billion of cuts embedded in the fiscal plan as he was walking us through the red ink, even with what we are talking about. Can you remind me the percentage of those reductions that affect schools?
Sure. Most of the cost reductions that are currently incorporated in the fiscal plan on the right sizing. I would say nearly just under half of them are actually related to the Department of Education. So that first line of the $10.8 billion that you see, majority of them are related to the Department of Education.
And then can you walk us through in the fiscal plan, in kind of what we're looking at right now, what's the total impact of measures? I'm just trying to understand, right, there's upside and there's downside. Margin of errors work in both directions. And we just talked about kind of Act 154 and kind of progress or lack thereof. And then the impending federal regulation as one factor that could have a material impact on the projections. But I just want to kind of, can you walk through a bit of, kind of risks and assumptions in the fiscal plan and how they tie into the surplus?
Sure. So if we look at scenario 3, which is what we have currently on the page, as Juan mentioned, if we look at the rightmost column, collectively over the next 30 years, there's just shy of approximately $50 billion in total measures, both in the form of structural reform and fiscal measures that are currently assumed in the fiscal plan. That $50 billion is roughly half and half in the context of structural reforms, so that would yield positive revenues, and then half in the context of cost reductions or fiscal measures, in addition to the cost reductions that have already happened to date. So when you ask about the risk measure, Anna, the way I look at it is, it has to be a balanced approach. And while these are estimates in terms of the impacts of any measures that are undertaken, that is one element of it in terms of what the numbers are. But I feel that the bigger element is in terms of the implementation aspect of this that needs to happen, which all of the board members have touched upon, that the implementation of it is going to be the real test in terms of achieving these savings in the fiscal plan.
Thank you. I think, clearly consensual deals are always preferable to contested ones. And clearly making the pie bigger is what we are all, what we've all been interested in working towards. I think that the question is, where are we really? And making sure that we don't, quoting Top Gun, that we don't write checks that our bodies can't cash. As we think about overall volume. I think about our obligation in Promesa, right? Its word around promise is around restoring opportunity, restoring growth. And, as it's been increasingly more challenging to continue balancing responsibilities and being on this board, one of the things that has kept me here is our obligation to, that 5-year-old girl or boy from Yabucoa. We know what happens when kids don't learn how to read by 3rd grade. We know that the numbers are far worse for Latino kids. We know that they are worse for kids that are living in poverty. We know that, 1 in 6 kids who are not proficient by 3rd grade don't graduate in time. We know that about a quarter drop out if their reading capacity is low or below basic at 3rd grade. We know that that number is 33% for Latino kids. We know that 26% of kids who are in poverty for at least 1 year and who are not reading proficient by 3rd grade drop out of high school. And we know what happens to lifetime earnings and opportunities with those outcomes. I think one of the things that, kind of continues to trouble me and is a focus for us is, what are we doing about that? What is our focus, and because getting to an agreement for the purposes of getting to an agreement, if it's unaffordable, if it's not feasible, it's not sustainable. And in a place, if we don't have, if we're not working on making the necessary investments that provide opportunity, then we're not accomplishing our charge. So that is the perspective that I think, you know, we need to bring as we think about how we're doing our job and what we've been called to, you know, to do here. It's about restoring, restoring opportunity. It's about restoring promise, and it's about providing the foundations for growth. And if we don't, you know, if we are irresponsible in carrying out our duties, and if we're not focused on what is feasible and what is affordable, and we, you know, we pretend that there are greater resources than there are here, not only are we doing a disservice to those that we are dealing with, but we are basically, you know, doing Puerto Rico and its future in a way that is how we got to where we are. And I think that is the perspective that I come from in thinking about these issues and thinking about, you know, this plan. In my view, the proposal that we're looking at is, you know, based on the current projections, is already bordering on unaffordable, and actually, you know, looks like it's unaffordable in its own terms. It may be as good as it gets, and it may be, but it's, you know, it's already beyond the limits of what appears to be affordable based on what we know today.
Mr. Chairman, can I respond?
Yes, you may.
Well said. And
so I'm sorry, Justin, that wasn't a question, but I very much appreciate your feedback.
Yeah, no, I agree with so much of what you said, and the people whose lives are at stake here. I think you're right. I view it just the same way. I think maybe I don't want to speak for you. I think we might have a different view on the way to get there. But at the end of the day, I think you're right. This is about the people of Puerto Rico. And I really believe that. That's why I look at this from a growth mentality vantage point. I don't think we can achieve growth if we are inequitable in our dealings with stakeholders. I don't think we can achieve growth if we don't finish this bankruptcy. And so at the end of the day, it is about the people of Puerto Rico, who I believe, as I've said many times, I've said in the press, should be self-governing. They shouldn't have a board over them. Something like Act 154, I believe in Puerto Rico. I believe in Mr. Marrero and the current administration and the incoming administration. I believe that they are going to be able to get that done. And I believe in their ability to do that without us. But I think we need to take a growth mindset. And so I agree 100% with you about what's at stake here. And I respect your point of view, and I thought it was very well spoken.
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, thank you. So just a second, Mr. Biggs. So Mr. Biggs is next up, wants to say a few things, and then Ms. Jaresko, and then Mr. Marrero all have comments or questions as well. So Mr. Biggs.
Oh, thanks very much. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak. I think I 100% agree with my fellow commissioner, Mr. Peterson, about having a growth mindset, that economic growth is really the key, not just to the success of Puerto Rico for the people of Puerto Rico, but also the key that to recovery from the bondholders. I disagree somewhat in thinking that the key to long-term economic growth is simply exiting bankruptcy or simply fixing Act 154. As important as those things are, I just don't think it's really possible to have long-term economic growth in Puerto Rico when you have what is probably the poorest business environment in the United States, the most restrictive and worst performing labor market, not only in the United States, but perhaps in the world, the poorest performing education system in the United States, the poorest level of financial reporting in the United States. And I'm sure I could go on from there. And I think the key here, and this is, Mr. Peterson, this is where I disagree with you a bit, where if you've come away with the perception that this has not been something the board has thought about, this is something the board has thought about from the beginning. And I would say that the board it really has been the group that's pushed this the most from the beginning. We have thought the most about structural reforms, which PROMESA explicitly calls for. And we have pushed these reforms in a whole variety of areas, even when, from the government side, there has been sort of something ranging from a lack of interest to a lack of execution to outright hostility. And that's over, to be frank, successive governments. From the bondholder side, there's been basically indifference of, hey, let's just cut deal. Don't worry about this other stuff. But the key to being able to afford debt repayments in the future is having an economy that grows. And it is these structural factors that keep Puerto Rico poor. It is, the key to long-term economic growth is not fixing Act 154 when you have kids graduating from high school or leaving high school, they cannot read. When you have high levels of corruption in government, which you do, when you have the lowest labor force participation rate in the world, when you have a very poor business environment, all of those things have to be fixed. And the board has focused on those things from the very beginning. We continue to. The issue here, and I think Ms. Jaresko outlined this, is the large number of downside risks, even in the sort of outline we've discussed today. That I know it's perceived that the level of debt payments are inadequate, but if I had to guess whether the government would be able to make those debt payments in the future, given the requirement that they actually follow through on structural reforms, I would guess that they won't be able to. And so the key here is making sure that the economy is capable of sustaining debt payments without pushing Puerto Ricans further into poverty. And so economic growth is a win-win here, but we have to focus on a whole range of issues. And I would just argue that the Oversight Board really has, from the very beginning, we've been very united in thinking about that. So, I welcome you onto the board, and I suspect, and I know this will be perceived as I'm pushing back on you, but I think as you look at these issues, I hope you will embrace the whole range of them, because without a true structural reform of Puerto Rico, the way it does business, or the way it governs, or the way the economy works, it's going to be very difficult to serve well either the people of Puerto Rico or the bondholders who are owed money by the government. I'll leave it at that, but I appreciate the chance to speak.
Thanks, Mr. Biggs. Ms. Jaresko?
Thank you. I would like to just clarify a few items, hopefully, with the help of some of my colleagues. First, I think that we all agree on the need for growth. And in fact, that growth and the assumption of that growth was written in from the very first fiscal plan. Unfortunately, with each year, the growth didn't happen. The reforms didn't happen. They didn't promote the growth, and it had to be pushed out into the future. Because we still expect and hope that this government, any future government, will in fact implement them. But there is this challenge between exiting from bankruptcy quickly and waiting for the growth to happen. And so I think to some extent, it's that balance that the proposal that I put on the table today tries to resolve. It is not saying that anyone can guarantee that the next governor, the next government, the next legislature will in fact implement all the reforms, but it is assuming that they will, so that we can show the revenues that are in those numbers and exit bankruptcy quickly. Since there is this relationship and the value of exiting bankruptcy will help with growth, rather than wait for the government to actually implement the reforms. They are written in and they are assumed despite lack of progress in the last 3 years. Again, whether there's blame to be placed or not is irrelevant. It's been an extremely difficult 4 years for the administrations that have been in office. But rather than wait for the growth, we have written the growth in, and we have assumed it will happen despite all odds in order to exit bankruptcy quickly. So that's the first element. The second is I'd like to ask Proskauer, Brian Rosen, Mr. Peterson, you mentioned this was a breach of contract, and I don't understand this, and I would never have proposed something had I believed that it was a breach of contract. So I'd just like to get clarification from lawyers rather than myself. Would filing a modified plan of adjustment be a breach of contract?
Good afternoon, Mr. Esco. This is Brian Rosen from Proskauer. Actually, the filing of an amended plan of adjustment is something that is exactly contemplated pursuant to the existing plan support agreement. There are mechanisms that are already taken into account. So I'm not clear where the breach of contract claim is coming from at this time.
In response to the issue of paying others perhaps more while we're taking money away from creditors, I'd like to make clear to everyone, in fact, what Mr. Peterson is referring to. This proposal included, yes, a reduction in recoveries for creditors as compared to the February 2020 modified plan of adjustment on file. If you show page 55, that is the reduction that's being proposed here. If you look on the left-hand column, that is the recovery for February, and the proposal that I've made today is in the far right-hand column. That said, what this did not include, and I should make clear, is that I also proposed, and it was in the cash flow numbers, that to respond to the governor of Puerto Rico, the legislature of Puerto Rico, and all the political parties in Puerto Rico, that when I proposed the CVI, which is the box up at the top, which was incremental to what was previously proposed during mediation, that we also recognize the request of the governor and the government to increase the threshold for the pension cut. And yes, that is an increase, as Mr. Peterson has said clearly, to a certain group of stakeholders, the retirees. That increase of the threshold from 1,200 to 1,500, which is, if you turn to the scenario 1 page, has a cost to the Commonwealth, or an incremental cost to the Commonwealth annually of some $30 million. It is in the second section of this page, the third line. It says pension threshold, 1,500 versus 1,200. That is the cost of what I've proposed in this discussion. And again, the reason I've proposed it is that, number one, we need consensual agreement from the government as well, and the legislature. And this is something that I don't want anyone in the government or the legislature or in either political campaign to believe has fallen to deaf ears. We understand this element. We understand what the average pension is, that it is for teachers under $1,450 and for police $1,322. And we understand the fact that retirees have had a series of reductions in their benefits even before PROMESA as a result of a pension freeze and the result of various benefits being taken away, including, importantly, the cost of living adjustment. They do not enjoy the cost of living adjustment, which from a real perspective has already reduced their benefits. And we have consistently tried to balance this very difficult situation with retirees with consensual agreements and with the fiscal situation in the in this proposal. But one other element that is not clear from this discussion, and perhaps I should have made it clear earlier, is that the Retirement Committee, or the core, and we had agreed on a funding of a pension trust. And what is on file reflects a pension trust that's being funded, relatively complex set of measurements. But when we moved to the post-COVID environment, unfortunately, that pension trust has lost as well. And it's important to note that no longer will the assumptions in the fiscal plan allow for the surpluses that were supposed to fund the pension trust. So while absolutely accurately, I have proposed increasing the pension threshold from 1,200 to 1,500, I want to be very clear that the pensioners are losing the security that was previously in the plan because the surpluses no longer allow for that level of pension trust support. And so they are losing something as well as the creditors are in this agreement. The last point I'll make, and I'll pass my time, is that somehow this was not in good faith from the perspective of the PSA creditors with whom we've been in mediation through September 30th and in constant dialogue even after September 30th. This proposal, if you go back to that page 55, this proposal comes as no shock to them. This proposal's been discussed with them. In fact, this proposal is better than what was blown out and better than what was discussed with them in mediation, because it answers one of the very critical questions. What if things are better than what you've proposed? What if the Oversight Board has underestimated the economic recovery or underestimated the amount of fiscal support that the federal government will provide, let's say, post-elections? What happens? Most of that fiscal recovery, most of that stimulus goes into consumption on this island, which raises SUT. And this CBI is proposed to put to rest that question. Well, what if it is better? Well, if it is better, they will enjoy that part of that economic recovery. And so it isn't going to come as a surprise. The same group of creditors that are negotiating in mediation, the same group of creditors that supported overwhelmingly that plan of adjustment modification in February 2020 may not be in agreement, but they will not be surprised in any way, because this is an improvement from where we've been in mediation in our discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Dresko. Mr. Marrero?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I just want to make a few points and some clarifications. I'll try, as a non-voting member of this oversight board, try to be the diplomatic and pragmatic, because in the end, as opposed to any other bankruptcy that we have seen in the private sector with corporations, healthcare companies, financial institutions, we're talking about people, not necessarily we're talking about assets, divisions, and line of businesses. So we need to understand that. So again, as for the growth reforms, as I said, publicly and privately, I totally agree with what my colleague Peterson just mentioned. And that's essentially what we have tried to do since day one. When we came into administration in January 2017, the first law that we signed, it was to expand the use and the optimization of public-private partnerships. That's the Law 1 2017. And why was that? Because at that time, we knew that the only tool available in the toolkit to support economic development, it was to increase the infrastructure, it was to increase the investment in infrastructure, something that we could do only through public-private partnerships. Since day one, we have been working in growth reforms in PREPA, PRASA, the Ports Authority, and many other services. However, after the first 6-7 months that we were working really hard in making sure that we could provide, establish the groundwork for the next steps, we were hit by 2 hurricanes, 5, Irma and Maria. At that point, we had to optimize the federal funding that would be available for Puerto Rico, not only to build back better, but also to support economic development. We saw it as a silver lining, as a great opportunity that we had at that time. And what we did to make sure that we could optimize this opportunity, we established a centralized oversight recovery office. We made sure that we're working really hard with FEMA, HUD, many other agencies to make sure that we could maintain that flow of funds, to make sure that we could, again, support economic development in order to expand the base. We totally agree with it, and we will totally support it. As for bankruptcy, I have said it many, many times, publicly and privately, and I will reiterate it. Since day one, we have been committed, like no other administration, to end the bankruptcy, since day one. As soon as I was appointed into AFAD, and as soon as the Governor Wanda Vasquez was sworn in, within one month, we publicly supported the plan of adjustment that at that time we had in place. And that's the record. And we did it even though not only it could cost politically, but because we were certain that we needed to end the bankruptcy, and because we were convinced that we could have the mechanisms and the tool to restore and make sure that any vulnerable population or creditor, as some of our folks would say, were fairly treated. Because again, even though we have to make sure that we are treated fairly and equitable, we have to make sure also that we take into consideration the different constituencies. So again, we are committed to the bankruptcy. We have, and that's the evidence, that's the record. We have already supported not only COFINA, GDB, PRASA restructuring, but also restructuring at the ports and PRIFA agency, and we will continue to do so. However, I have to say that as to the new or revised plan of adjustment that has been presented, I will be honest. I'm glad to see some progress in some respects as to the debt service profile, because as we have said since the beginning, to the extent that it's not feasible, to the extent that we cannot execute it, it will not be sustainable. I'm glad that I have seen some improvement in the infrastructure as well and in the pension treatment. I think that it reiterates the need to treat differently some constituents. And even though Justin or Mr. Peterson, I do agree that our creditors need a fair treatment, I also want to point out the difference between the creditors and the pensioners. In all bankruptcies, the pensioners have been treated differently. Why? Because they didn't lend willingly. They didn't lend voluntarily to the government of Puerto Rico. They didn't participate in this collapse of the pension system. They did not consent to prior public administration that entered into questionable transactions that in essence collapsed the promise of a decent pension. And let's be honest, not only the data that Ricardo mentioned and that Ana reviewed, 60% of people, not only children, 60% of people in Puerto Rico is facing the poverty level risk right now in the middle of the pandemic, because those numbers, yes, reflect that 40% of people live in the poverty level. Let's go outside. We'll see children, women, elderly, they're struggling every single day. So again, even though as a former corporate securities attorney, I could understand that from a bankruptcy, this could be done easily if we were on a corporate world. We're talking about people, we're talking about life, and in that respect, we also have to take into consideration that, as I said, they did not voluntarily lend, they did not voluntarily consent to the prior administration to use their money and collapse the pension system. So again, as for the transaction, I think that, as I said, I'm seeing some progress, but this is the first time that I see the presentation. So I think that in order to fulfill my fiduciary responsibilities with the people of Puerto Rico, with the government of Puerto Rico, and obviously with the governor of Puerto Rico, we need some time to look at not only at the fine print, but also at the different elements of this structure to make sure that we can support it. But again, make no mistake, we have been clear as to our request. We have been clear as to our position since day one, since the day that we supported the plan of adjustment back in September 2019. And we said it, and we will repeat it, that any improvement in the treatment for the bondholders, it has to come with an improvement in the pensioner. Not because we want a fair, unfair, and unequitable treatment with our bondholders or creditors, of course not, but because we have an obligation with the most vulnerable. We have an obligation to make sure that for the next 20, 30 years, the people of Puerto Rico will be able to have a functioning government. So again, I want to end with some quotes of Judge Swain that I think is very important to put in perspective my position. And as I said, I don't want to be disrespectful as to any position of my colleagues in the board, but I have to highlight what we're dealing with and provide some more context to our discussion. Judge Swain said, and I quote, "While pursuing returns for creditors of each debtor is an important element of those judgments, that is not the exclusive end point of the oversight board's task. The needs, the concerns, and the future of a political entity that is the home of millions of American citizens, as well as the needs, concerns, and rights of a broad range of bodies in interest, including our creditors, and the ability to propose confirmable plan of adjustment are all implicated here. I also add that the goal of these PROMESA cases is not merely to maximize creditor recoveries. Rather, these restructuring cases require a more holistic approach that focuses on the continuation of a future government and its instrumentalities and their ability to meet the needs of the Commonwealth residents, as well as provide proper recompense for our creditors." So again, and I will repeat so I am not misunderstood, we are committed to the process of bankruptcy, and we will support any way that, and we have supported, we have participated many times in the mediations, and we will continue to do so if it's necessary, because we believe that's the obligation, and that's the most important part of our job right now. So again, we will collaborate, you know that, because we have done in many respects, but not to the expense of voluntarily relinquishing any democratic rights or social justice principles, because doing so not only will run afoul of our fiduciary duties as government officials, but also will run afoul of a long-standing American tradition that the government of the people should be for the people and by the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Marrero. We have a number of people who would like to speak. So Mr. Peterson, and then Ms. Matasantos, then Mr. Biggs, then Ms. Jaresko. So starting with Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I just wanted to respond to Brian's comment on my characterization of this modification of the plan of adjustment as a breach of contract. My understanding, not as a lawyer at Proskauer, so I must say that up front, is that a plan of adjustment which materially alters the PSA is a breach of contract and would in any case be interpreted as such by the other side. And just more general in bankruptcy, when you're treating parties differently in the middle of a negotiation, you know, given the CVI structure does not include all of the creditors, I think that is where somebody could call this a breach of contract. Again, I'm not an attorney like you. I think it was a bit of an overstatement on your part to say there's no room for this to be called a breach of contract. So I just wanted to respond to that. And then I would say on the increase to other stakeholders, again, just to point out the inequality of this. We're talking about folks that, yes, you know, they may be dealing with the same economic conditions that all Americans are, but they're getting paid. They're not impaired. They're not impaired. And we have an entire class of creditors, the Commonwealth creditors, by the way, with priority, and I know that has never mattered to this group, that has never been paid anything. And so that's what I mean when I talk about inequity. And I just think, again, let's deal in reality here. Let's be real with each other about what we're talking about. We're talking about telling a group of Commonwealth creditors that we don't have the money to do this deal anymore because of COVID, but we're going to give away the store to this other class of stakeholders and take it from you. So I just want us all to be clear about what this plan of adjustment really is.
Thank you. Ms. Matasantos?
Natalie, I'm not sure who best to ask my questions to. I have a couple of questions on pensions. Is Adam the best person, or do you want me to go with what they are and then go to whoever is the right one?
Just give us the questions and we'll see who answers.
Can you just remind us a bit on the structure of Sistema 2000 and a bit on the pension history in Puerto Rico? Also remind us a bit on the extent to which pension income is spent in Puerto Rico and kind of also thinking through how these numbers tie to poverty line in terms of what we're looking at. My recollection is that the Sistema 2000 system has been had been solely funded by employees, and that employees' assets were diverted to pay for other pensions and are not in those accounts. It just would be helpful to just be reminded a bit of the history here in terms of the extent to which these funds were diverted and used in some ways to be able to pay debt for a longer period of time and to pay for other services. Just can remind me a bit on that history, and then as well as the benefit levels and what we're talking about, how they relate to poverty level, how this ties to kind of where the dollars are spent and how that in turn ties to economic activity on the island. And then I have some questions after that relative to the pension trust and what happens at the end of 10 years under the proposal to pension benefits and their funding in the future.
Adam, could you take a shot at it? And I'm happy to fill in the blanks if necessary.
All right, I'm happy to, Natalie. And thank you for the question, Anna. In terms of Sistema 2000, it should be noted that the defined benefit system in Puerto Rico was closed in 1999. So starting in the year 2000, employees continued to have a portion of their paycheck taken out without their consent. It was a mandated allocation of money that was put aside for their retirement as well, and their retirement security. Because of a quirk in the way that it was structured in the design of the plan, unlike a 401k or a 403b type structure where that money is kept in trust for that person's retirement, those funds were commingled with the main retirement systems. And as a consequence, that money was spent just like all of the other money allocated for the retirement security of the workers in Puerto Rico. So the Sistema money was only employee allocations. The government did not have an employer match. They had a interest credit that was supposed to be allocated to that worker. That interest credit was also not paid, and that money from the employees was commingled with the defined benefit trust and was subsequently spent down by the government in its entirety. Secondarily, as it relates to who is receiving these benefits and how does it relate to the poverty level and economic activity on the island, data from the retirement systems shows that approximately over 90%, I think it's always close to 96% of the pension benefits are paid to retirees that still live on the island. And because the average benefit is so low, virtually all, if not all, of that money is spent on consumption on the island, basic household goods needed to survive. And so there is a recirculation effect that happens on the island. The last point that might be relevant here to be aware of is the government had been underfunding its pension system for years. It was a decision taken by the government to, rather than allocate and put money aside for retirees, it had to prioritize other purposes for those funds. And that's in part what led to the depletion of those assets set aside for the retirees over time. Again, with the System 2000 money being commingled into that account and also subsequently being spent in its entirety. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think that gives some context.
It does. The one outstanding one on this kind of particular elements is kind of remind me how the benefit ties to the poverty level. Just in terms of what percentage of poverty does the benefit and the benefit payments generally equate to?
So I think the poverty level, and Ricardo Fuentes is on the line from the board's economist, but the poverty level is about the same or a little bit lower than the average benefit. So the average benefit is not it's not overly generous for I would say the broad majority of people who receive some sort of benefit.
I just wanted to add, Adam, if you want to refer to it, but these are the impairments that have happened before PROMESA. In addition, there's the freeze. So just in terms of the retirees being impaired, and then the numbers that you're asking for, Anna, I think this doesn't show, this shows the average pensions, which, Ricardo, can you tell us what the poverty level is? Because I can't, it's not on the page there.
So the poverty level is approximately 12,000 a year. So that would imply that this would allow for less people to fall under the poverty line, or no one to fall under the line with these amount of reductions.
So it's roughly looking at 150% of poverty as the floor that would be established. Ricardo, do I have that right?
Yes, roughly, yes.
Great, thank you.
And this tells the difference between who's affected and who continues to be impaired, just so that it's clear.
That's helpful. Can someone speak to kind of the implications of the pension trust not being funded?
I'm going to ask Gaurav, I think.
Sure. So in terms of this, there's two elements of the pension trust. And if we go back to the plan of adjustment back in February, we were assuming that just shy of about $6 billion would actually go into the pension trust, supported by the surplus that was going to be available under the original plan. However, now that pension trust contribution, given the existing fiscal plan, has been reduced to just north of $1 billion. So there is a reduction there. And the implications of really the pension trust were that, post restructuring, there was the real view to make sure that the pensions, at least going forward, were going to be protected. So at the end of 10 years, we still are probably looking at an underfunding in the pensions of roughly $26 billion that still need to get funded. So the going forward sort of projections, after 10 years, when they're in deficit territory, because the assumption is that pensions continue to get underfunded. But the other way to look at that is that there isn't a level of funding that can clearly be shown right now to ensure that those future pensions do get funded. So Anna, I don't know if that answers your question.
It does, thank you.
Yeah.
And then just one more thing, if I may, Mr. Chair, I just wanted to add myself to Andrew's comments around both the board's focus on economic growth and on restoring growth in Puerto Rico, and the need for that to be a continued critical priority. Agree with everybody that is something that we've both been focused on from the beginning, and that it is critical not only for creditors, but most importantly for the people of Puerto Rico and for Puerto Rico's future.
Thanks, Ms. Montesantos. Mr. Biggs?
No, I'm sorry. I'm fine. Thank you.
And I think we had Mr. Esco again.
I'm fine as well. Thank you.
Any other comments or conversation or questions about the plan generally? And then let me turn to the motion itself and see if I'll read it and then see if there are any questions about the motion. So the motion that Mr. Esco put before us, or suggested that we considered, says, resolved, the board authorizes the immediate commencement of negotiations with creditors and other parties under the current mediation agreement, consistent with the proposals contained in Exhibit 4, with a view to the filing of an amended plan of adjustment as soon as practically possible. I think Ms. Montesantos had a question or questions about that. And if anybody else has questions or comments or discussion, we can take up those as well. Ms. Montesantos?
My question, and I don't know if it's maybe it's to Jaime, but I want to understand whether if the motion were what was proposed by Natalie, does the staff have the authority to be able to move forward with the filing of the plan under that motion as soon as practicable, with a plan that is amendments to the plan that are consistent with what's been presented, or would a subsequent vote be needed to be able to make that possible?
Again, the recommendation is that these proposals be the basis of an amended plan of adjustment, that the board, through its staff and advisors, engage with creditors immediately in terms of negotiating on the basis of these proposals in order to have a plan of adjustment. That if those negotiations produce changes on the basis of these proposals, that we come back and seek your approval as to those changes. But that if those negotiations, let us say, fail, you are authorizing us to proceed to file an amended plan of adjustment, incorporating the proposals that are that you have in front of you. What the resolution is not doing it is not authorizing us to proceed now to file a plan of adjustment on the basis of these proposals. It is a precondition to the filing is to engage in negotiations with the creditors.
Thank you, Mr. El-Khoury. Other questions or comments on the resolution itself? Would somebody like to move that we vote on the resolution?
I would like to move a modified resolution. I would like the resolution to be crystal clear, to change the language around with the view, to be clear that that the staff can move forward with a filing. And I would like us to consider, and that it's clear that basically we're going to move forward with a filing consistent with this as soon as practicable. All good for another, round of conversations, but I want to be crystal clear under the motion that that basically the staff can move forward with a filing, post those conversations, and that anything that would be different than what is authorized would require a subsequent board vote. Jaime, can you take a crack at how to modify that to be clear? I think in my view, with the view is not as clear as I think I would like it to be.
Mr. Chair, I have a question.
Go ahead, sure.
For Jaime. Jaime, if I leave the meeting and break quorum right now, we're not going to vote on this, right?
I would say that the chairman will have to, before taking a vote, find if there is a quorum.
Okay, great. Well, what my colleague Anna is recommending is not what we agreed to. The resolution that we agreed to was negotiations must precede any filing, and we are not authorizing the staff to proceed with the filing right away. So I am leaving the meeting now and breaking quorum. Goodbye.
But Justin, that's not what all right.
All right, so
Dave,
I think.
Just for the record, might be good for you to just see if there's a quorum, just so that the minutes can reflect that there's no quorum.
Okay, it appears at this point that we have 3 board members present. We need 4 board members for a quorum. So at this point, we don't have a quorum for further formal board decisions. All of the decisions that we've made up to this point in time, we did have a quorum for, subject to correction by Mr. El-Khoury. But we don't have, but we do not have a quorum at this point. So, any other comments on this? This is just discussion at this point. Why don't we close the discussion on the plan of adjustment then, and we'll turn now to public comments.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, I was a little slow on the button there. I mean, I'll just say I wish things had not moved quite so quickly there. It would have been my preference to, I think, retain what we had retain the previous language in order that we could retain the quorum. So maybe we can revisit this and figure out a way that we can go forward with things.
Thank you, Mr. Biggs.
Is it okay to jump in?
Ms. Santos?
I agree. It's unfortunate that the decision of a board member to pull back, and I also wanted to be clear that I was in no way saying no conversations. I just want clarity that the staff could file post those conversations, and I think that the motion was not the language was not clear on that point, so I'm hopeful that we can come back and be moving on a path forward, but so it goes.
Thank you, Ms. Montesantos. Anybody else on this before we shift over to public comments? Why don't we turn to public comments? So we'll spend a little bit of time responding to questions that we've received through our website. And I don't, Ms. Jaresko, will they come to you? Okay, so why don't we turn to that?
I don't know that I'll always be able to answer them, but I will try. I may ask some of my colleagues and Mr. Morado to help at times. The first question comes from John Mudd. This one I can answer. Are the slides used by the board today available on the board's website? Yes, the slides will be all available on the meeting website. Question from Jeremias. Many of the bondholders are not asking for full payment on the constitutional debt. Why is the board still negotiating? I think the best way to say this is that, yes, there are creditors who are not demanding 100%, but that doesn't make still all the proposals affordable or legal. All the settlements have to be within the certified fiscal plan debt sustainability analysis. In addition, I think it's important to say that some of the debt has been challenged on the ground that it exceeded the debt limit in the Puerto Rico Constitution. So I believe we're close with the major portion of the creditors, but not with all. A question from Esteban Sanchez. The government is restructuring Puerto Rico's debt and is not making payments to all of the bondholders. Why are the municipalities drowning in debt? Is the municipality debt being restructured? No, so far, no municipality has been taken into Title III. That doesn't mean that they're not refinancing and trying to put their debt in order, but not through the Title III and not with the Oversight Board. We've been willing to work with any municipality that believes its debt burden might be unsustainable, but no one has come forward. Kate Long asks, what efforts has the FOMB made to move the Puerto Rico government to compliance with the request/demand of U.S. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin over a year ago with the 2017 federal tax reform, i.e. convert an excise tax to an income tax? Also, why does employee income tax revenue go up in the fiscal plan while Act 154 revenue projections go down? In terms of the first question, so as we mentioned during the presentation, we have been, even before Secretary Mnuchin and the federal tax reform, requiring of the government, discussing with each of several secretaries of Hacienda, the need to implement a tax reform to take into account the potential of non-creditability, which we've been aware of since 2016. That said, as I think the answer to what's been done was given by Mr. Morado in terms of the numerous efforts that have been made. What we can do is continuously urge and participate in these conversations and continue to press forward. Part of today's public discussion of Act 154 is again an attempt to raise the level of awareness and urgency with regard to this issue. I'm not sure the second question, why does employee income tax revenue go up in the fiscal plan while 154 revenue projections go down? That probably has a much more complex answer. I will get back to you in writing. That has to do with the fact that Act 154 is only a portion of the employment on the island. It is, we gave you the numbers of 70-some thousand, but that's direct and indirect. So it's actually smaller number when you look directly at Act 154. So this has to do with the rest of the economy and the rest of employment, I believe, but I will get back to you on that. Francisco Ortiz Berlingueri asks, municipalities have many expenditures that are not essential services, especially regarding publicity and parties, which is detrimental to the rest of citizens who need the basic services. We agree, Mr. Ortiz, when we are trying to take steps to improve municipal revenues, reduce costs, assist the municipalities to provide those services, and better prioritize the funds that they do have. However, it is a process in terms of budgeting and prioritization of those who are spending the funds in the end. Gladys Rivera writes, please approve Law 80. We are not asking for anything more than to be able to retire with a pension that is not miserable, receiving 38% or less from a gross monthly salary of $19,790 after giving almost 40 years of my life is very unfair when there are people who are being given $50,000 and even more per month. Thank you. Ms. Rivera, we are working hard to reform the retirement system. We are reviewing the responses that we did receive, in fact, from the government of Puerto Rico on the 28th. And we will be responding to the responses that we've received from the government shortly with regard to laws 80, 81, and 82. Violeta Tirado writes, a civil service reform in Puerto Rico is pending. When will the designated panel submit the final report to the Oversight Board about this issue? Don't think there's going to be a final report. That was a discussion piece, which was meant to have the effect it actually had on the island, which was to spur conversation about how civil service could be improved, how civil service could become more effective and more cost effective, but also managerially effective in delivering services to the people of Puerto Rico. There are other research products based on civil service on our website that you can see as well, but there is no report due to us on this subject. This was something that we voluntarily took up and developed in order to spur a conversation. The next question, also from Violeta Tirado, is the FOMB Research and Policy Department going to address, for the purpose of the civil service reform in Puerto Rico, how permanent employees mistreat or abuse temporary employees in state government agencies? There are many, many cases of temporary government employees whose contracts are terminated or not renewed when they report irregularities in their work area to supervisors. Can the civil service reform of Puerto Rico contain provisions to protect temporary government employees who report irregularities or corruption in their workplace? That would be something that would be protected most likely by a whistleblower policy of the government, and I'll refer that to Mr. Marrero in terms of what the policies are. I'm sure he can get back to us at another time. It's a complicated question on whistleblower policies in place to protect employees who report inaccuracies. Mr. Marrero will give us a written answer, and we'll post it on the website. Pedro Vasquez asks, for many decades there has been unaccounted water production to sales for PRASA. What are you doing to fix the system losses of water at PRASA? Mr. Vasquez, we agree fully, and if you look at the fiscal plans for the past 3 years, this non-revenue water or water that's not being paid for has been a very big part of the efforts. Too much of PRASA's water, in fact, is being lost because of the reported water main breaks, faulty meters, and other deficiencies. About 50 to 60% is been estimated to be wasted, lost, or stolen in the process from start until it gets to our homes. And we need the water to be more reliable, cleaner, but we also need not to be wasting so much. So the fiscal plan provides a roadmap for those operational measures that need to happen at PRASA, and PRASA is implementing some of those operational measures to reduce that non-revenue water. There is an aggressive remediation plan, which includes master meters, not meters at your home, but meters at the production facilities, so that we understand at least where the water is being lost between the production and the recipient, as well as implementing a program for repairing those leaks. And the funds for that repair and remediation do exist in the PRASA budget and fiscal plan. Esteban Sanchez writes, the government is restructuring Puerto Rico. Oh, we had that already. I'm sorry. Brenda Stacy writes, as per the PRIDCO fiscal plan dated June 29, 2020, on page 20, PRIDCO was to submit to the board on September 30th, 2020, a proposed lease template for review by the Oversight Board. Was this submitted, and what is the status of a new lease template being implemented? Will there be public comment on this proposed template, especially from businesses currently dealing with the PRIDCO real estate department? No, Brenda, it was not submitted. I do not have that. And the purpose of the milestone was to standardize lease contracts for businesses so that there wouldn't be individual negotiations that occurred. No public comment is required by law. However, we're happy to hold a public session to discuss whatever comes in and have a conversation when it does. Victor Gonzalez asks, yesterday, the FOMB lawyer repeated once more the mantra, quote, the expenses incurred by the Puerto Rican people in footing Promesa bills is money well spent because FOMB has saved billions of dollars, unquote. Who do you shortchange though? Why do you shortchange those who sold to the government on credit and those with valid contracts with PREPA while you provide hundreds of millions of dollars from Puerto Rican taxpayers to lawyers, lobbyists, consultants, and staff? I don't wish to speak for Mr. Bienenstock, but I think the point that he was making yesterday was that the Oversight Board's attorneys and other professionals have saved the Commonwealth over $9 billion as compared to their professional fees, which amount to about $200 million over 4 years. That $10 billion consists of saving about $2 billion or more in interest that would have otherwise been taken out of pension payments by the ERS bondholders, and saving the Commonwealth about $5 billion or more plus interest that it would have otherwise had to pay HTA for its debt service, nearly $2 billion plus interest for PRIFA, and over $500 million plus interest for CCDA, the Convention Center. These are all representative of cases that, yes, they were litigated. However, we have won and defended the Commonwealth assets in these cases, and we have supported the full payment of all valid vendor claims and contracts entered into after the commencement of PREPA's Title III case. But the pre-petition claims are part of the bankruptcy. Victor Gonzalez asks again, what have you done since March of last year when Noel Zamot, the Infrastructure Revitalization Coordinator, resigned to carry out PROMESA's Title V mandate? As Mr. Justin, our new Oversight Board member, and several other board members today outlined, attracting investment to Puerto Rico is a very critical and high priority of the board. We have been open to and discussing various economic development proposals, including the reshoring of pharma and the of pharma medical device manufacturers. We have discussed very much, as Mr. Biggs has described, those competitive elements of the economy that need to be changed in order to have a shot at competing for new investment dollars. And the board continues to receive petitions under Title V while I continue to recruit someone who meets the very specific conditions that are in the law PROMESA for who can serve as a revitalization coordinator. We are processing them as I've been named interim revitalization coordinator, and we will continue to see those Title V projects proceed. Okay, there are two more, but give me a minute. This one is long. Victor Gonzalez writes, your greatest power as described by Christine J. Joe in her article, I don't know who that is, Section 314B7 of PROMESA confirmation hinders the efficiency of the bankruptcy system because 1, it gives the court a meaningless power by inadvertently permitting the court to determine whether a plan of adjustment is consistent with the applicable fiscal plan. And 2, it negates the sole discretionary authority of the Oversight Board. Among other requirements, 314B provides that the court shall confirm a plan of adjustment if it is consistent with an applicable fiscal plan. While this may seem innocuous at first, the duty to approve and certify a fiscal plan is solely reserved to the Oversight Board. PROMESA makes it quite convincing that it is the Oversight Board's exclusive responsibility to, quote, certify a plan of adjustment only if it determines in its sole discretion that the plan is consistent with the applicable certified fiscal plan, unquote. To effectuate the fundamental goal of a bankruptcy proceeding, 314B7 of PROMESA should be removed from 314B to resolve the conflict created by its inclusion. End of quote. Why have you not used this to push vigorously for mediation? After all, back in 2017, you had all the stakeholders in the room with the judges who had accepted to act as mediators. Mr. Gonzalez, we have been in mediation since I arrived at the board. We have vigorously moved mediation in every area where the mediators have offered and have very successfully mediated. Mediation is what enabled the COFINA plan of adjustment and the settlement of the COFINA GO. We today, although we didn't vote on it, suggested returning immediately to that mediation. So I won't, and I'm not a lawyer, I'm not qualified to discuss the 314B7, but to your question, we are vigorously engaging in mediation. M. Cruz asks the last question today. PREPA is currently in a transition to LUMA, and the employees need to decide if we are going to apply for a position or continue with the government. How are we going to make a decision when there is no information about what is going to happen with the pension system? Can we get official information and or FOMB's point of view about the pension system? Short answer is yes. We are working with the government, with PREPA, with LUMA to put out a set of questions and answers that will be very factual and explain under what circumstances what occurs in accordance with Puerto Rico law, in accordance with the LUMA contract and requirements at LUMA. But I think it is important to note, and it should come as no surprise, that the Oversight Board agrees and has long argued that PREPA requires a pension reform as one of its key elements of transformation, along with the debt restructuring and the transformation of the grid, the transformation of management of generation. The pension system at PREPA faces a significant underfunding, and some type of reform will have to occur to avoid it going bankrupt. And while that reform, what that reform entails is something that we continue to define and work with the government on, but the approach that was used for the other pension systems, similarly troubled pension systems, more troubled pension systems, involved elements of a freeze of benefits where no new benefits are accrued. It involves reducing benefits that have been accrued over a certain amount of time, so a cut, something we discussed earlier today when we discussed a change in the potential threshold for the cut at the Commonwealth. And we firmly believe that those employees that transfer to LUMA will benefit from better working conditions, reduced uncertainty, as well as LUMA's own retirement savings plan if they so choose. We encourage that all employees meet with LUMA, and we will work very hard to get that question and answer done so you can make knowledgeable and informed decisions. I don't know if Mr. Moreno wants to add anything. No, so those are all the questions that we've received. Again, I know we owe answers on at least 2 of them. We will post that on the website. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Esco. That brings us to the end of our business for today. It was a very productive meeting. I think we got a lot of decision-making done. My hope is that we'll be able to have another public meeting soon to formally move forward on the plan or the proposal for a plan. We will we'll be public about that. We'll be public about all of our decision making from here on forward. So we can't formally conclude the meeting, but I will informally conclude the meeting by saying thanks to everybody for participating. We hope this is helpful. And we will likely have another public meeting soon. Thanks so much to all.